Jasmine. I don't know. I imagine she's basically late. She's here. We're only 1 minute over, so. Where's the team? Very well. She'll be nice.
She was here earlier.
Oh, she was. Oh, you mean she's here? Yeah, it just hasn't gotten here.
A vacation trip. All right.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and get started.
She was physically.
One bit of housekeeping I just wanted to bring up. Last meeting, everyone had a lot to say, and it got to be somewhat of a runaway train, so if we can kind of curtail some of the commentary to go to the, to speak kind of in order, that would probably make it a little more efficient, so appreciate that. First item that we have is the review and adopt the minutes from February 1st, the Bloodstain Pattern Analysis Committee, and the meetings from the quarterly meeting in February. Do I have a motion to adopt? Second? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay. We're going to take one item out of order, and that's item number 12. Mr. Wyckoff, you have anything to report on that?
No, thank you for letting me go out of order. Yeah, we've had some very dramatic DNA mixture recalculation results. We had a case in Harris County that went from an initial number of 1 and 1.6 million to an inconclusive. And so we're meeting with prosecutors. We're having, candidly, we're having some problems getting the recalculations done by the labs. And I understand, I'm always very sympathetic to how busy they are, but we've got several where we're just about 2 years since we asked for a recalculation, and we're not getting anything. But they're busy, they're understaffed, we're working through it. But we're getting, as we get some of these recalculated results in, we're getting some pretty dramatic differences. It still remains to be seen whether these are going to be material differences to the case.
Any of those rerun specimens?
Yes, in fact, the one I just mentioned was, and there's another one from the same lab, which is IFS, and we're going to go out and meet with them, we being the conviction integrity unit people and I, when I get back. So it's you know, it's promising.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right. Back to second item, the office administrative update.
Sure. In your materials, you have the FY 2018 budget status report, and I'd like to say that we're very happy to announce includes our new staff member, Brian Keenan, who's here with us. Brian is a licensing specialist, formerly with DPS, and Brian is going to be helping us process all of our applications. He's physically housed here in the building upstairs with the JBCC, which is the Judicial Bureau Certification Commission, and they do all of the other licensing and certification programs for the agency. But Brian comes over to see us frequently. He will be dedicated to us as we get this first class of licensees through the process, and then after that, depending on the volume, he may split his time between the forensic licenses and some of the other licenses or certifications that the agency maintains. So we're extremely excited to have Brian. He has lots of skills in Excel, which is a huge benefit for us since half of us are lawyers. And so he's been able to already crunch a bunch of data that we're using to analyze the forensic exam. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. So his salary is reflected in the new budget update. So This is a budget that you all already had approved because we anticipated the addition of Brian. This is just the first meeting that he's attended.
So the salary is 100% covered by the commission?
Yes.
If there is a sharing of responsibilities, the salary is still going to be out of the commission, or is it shared with a different department?
It will be divided. Yeah, I don't think that we're going to, OCA has been really good about making it clear to us that this is one agency, and to the extent that we need to adjust to be able to ensure that everything is covered, they'll help with that.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we're in really good shape with that. We've had tons of support from David Slayton, so that's helpful. So that's on the budget. Does anyone have questions about any of the budgetary items, clarification? So one of the things that I did last week, which is the first time I've done this, is I went with David Slayton, who's the executive director of the agency, and our chief financial officer, Jennifer Henry, over to meet with the legislative budget board and a representative from the governor's office. And what they do, now that we've moved outside of higher ed, there's a whole new world of things that we need to comply with and take into consideration that OCA has been doing for many years. And one of the things that is done during the interim is that agencies, especially ones with licensing and oversight regulatory authority, are given things called strategic measures. And so the Legislative Budget Board assigned us a number of strategic measures that they'd like us to keep track of. And actually, I think it's helpful because there's some things that will ensure that we are tracking our data closely. So you can see some of the performance measures are in your material. These are the ones that we had proposed. So what we'll be tracking is total number of licenses, total number of accredited laboratories, number of complaints and laboratory disclosures received, and then number of complaints and laboratory disclosures resolved. Additionally, we've added number of new licenses per biennium, number of newly accredited laboratories, and number of complaints resolved within a year. So or percentage-wise, so what they want to see is how timely is our process, which is something that's been sometimes a challenge for us. Number one, because we have a small staff, but number two, because a lot of what we're able to do is dependent on how quickly we get information back from the laboratories, and they are also busy. So these will be performance, and the meetings are quarterly. So one of the reasons why the lead analyst at LBB set the annual measure was because he thought for agencies whose meetings are quarterly, they want to see percentage resolved within a year, taking into consideration that the commission doesn't meet weekly or anything like that. So we're going to be implementing these. One of the things that the gentleman from the LBB advised me was you should make sure they're set up and they're solid from the beginning, because all of these strategic measures are subject to audit. And so we need to make sure that our systems are robust so that if any moment we get a call that says, oh, we're gonna come audit your strategic measures, that we're ready for that. So the good news is, because we're part of the Office of Court Administration and we have the resources of this large judicial branch agency, they will be helping us set up all of our strategic measures and tracking those strategic measures. A lot of it we already do. We do it because we report it in our annual report, and we do it because the governor's office tracks this information for purposes of Coverdell compliance, because they are the Coverdell grant administrator for the state. But we can still always use improvement to those processes. So that's kind of a major development on the administrative front that we had recently. Any questions about that?
When they put down desired performance of higher than target, if you achieve higher than target, does that become the new target? Because at some point you cannot.
Right, so when you go, so there were a couple of measures from other directors that they took off because, so here's an example. Our chief technology officer had a target of e-filing for the courts. Well, their target was 100%, but every year they've hit 99 point whatever it is. And so they took that measure away because it's no longer measuring anything because everybody's doing it. So they will adjust the measures and adjust the targets. The legislature sets the targets.
Oh, okay.
And the legislature evaluates how you're doing and what your budgetary needs are based in some part on these measures. So the good news is that the LVB representative there said, I don't know how you are doing what you're doing with the staff that you have. And it seems like a lot. I said, well, it is. And they said, this will help you with that because data is always helpful. So, because we're tiny compared to other agencies with similar responsibilities. So that's where we're at. But they were extremely supportive, and the governor's office as well. So that was good. Anything else on strategic measures? We have transitioned our website from our old site over to Texas Courts. It still needs work, we're aware of that, so we will keep working on it. We do have a developer who's dedicated to us, but moving all of the information over was a large task. But OCA really wanted us to be part of the Texas Courts site. So if anyone has questions or issues with the website, please just let us know. The electronic binders, which I know is your favorite subject, so the Chief Technology Officer is also right now doing research on board software that is, its sole purpose is to help commissions and boards with their material for the meetings. And what he's done is he's surveying his colleagues, other chief technology officers, to see what they use for statewide commissions and boards, and then he'll come and show us what the options are. So you still get your hard copy binders, at least for now. But what they want to do is distribute iPads, like what Dr. Kerrigan has, that all commissioners will use, and then with this software that will be more nimble than ShareFile, which is not very nimble at all because it's supposed to be secure, you'll be able to access all of your meeting materials that way. That's the idea.
Would it even be feasible, instead of getting the FedEx and the binder, just to get a memory stick? Just because it takes so long to download some of the materials from ShareFile?
We could definitely send memory sticks. I will say that some of your colleagues really want their binder.
Well, just for the people who may want it.
Yes.
I had to change of heart. I don't want the binder
Well, once
They call me a dinosaur.
We'll keep working on this, but yes, we can send a memory stick for sure. One of the nice things about having a board specific software is they're intended for this purpose, and some things change at the last minute. We get, the laboratory sends a corrective action and they send it 2 days before, and we want to make sure you have it. So it's nice to be able to real-time access everything, or any changes to language in a report or anything like that. We can electronically, that's a lot easier to achieve. Otherwise, what we're doing is passing out, as you walk in the door, 5 supplements for your binder. So, yeah. I know Dr. Bernard has opinions on this, so.
I'll just have to get my grandchildren to show me how to operate it. Other than that, it's fine.
Okay. So, is there anything else, Lee, that I've forgotten on the administrator side? That's good.
Well, can I ask
Just
about
ask.
reimbursements, if everybody's getting their reimbursements, okay? Because I did get some help last time, when I was first learning. It was rough because I had the BPA and the commission and the licensing advisory all at once, and it was a little overwhelming. So I do have help if I get overwhelmed again, but I think I've kind of got my system down now, so hopefully it'll be a little smoother from now on.
Are you getting reimbursed relatively promptly, like within, which I would consider to be 2 to 4 weeks? 24
weeks, 30+ days, probably.
No, I get mine in 2 weeks now. Does anyone, is that okay? Sorry.
Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 4, it's fine.
Okay. Well, if anyone has any issues, please let us know, because sometimes we get backed up and we need to let them know. Okay.
Yes, we'll talk about the licensing software stuff on the licensing.
All right, the next section are the complaints and self-disclosures. Mr. Daniel?
Yes, sir. The complaints disclosures committee, just for myself, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Drake, actually did not do our typical meeting yesterday, the day before the meeting to review this because of the known amount of new complaints and new disclosures, so we decided to do it here with the entire commission. And as usual, the staff did their superb job of reviewing all these matters, providing us adequate material. But the first item is complaint 1812. It's by Emmanuel Obai, who's a civil lawyer involving what appears to be a suicide in Nacogdoches County. He had a complaint regarding the Florida State pattern analysis, which was done by the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. You know, we had a full afternoon in February reviewing that. Staff had reviewed this carefully and provided a recommendation that the complaint should be dismissed, primarily because it involves findings of forensic pathologists. And due to our extensive work in this area back in February on the same issue, and it involved a civil case. Mr. Obai is very nice. He said, I don't have superior knowledge of this, but for other people. So I would entertain a question, comments, concerns, along with a motion.
I would make a motion to dismiss.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Our second complaint was from Richard Gibson. He was alleging prosecution and falsified the toxicology report from back in 2006 involving intoxication manslaughter offense. And frankly, as you looked at it, hardly seen enough facts that would guide you to professional negligence or misconduct, and staff had provided a recommendation to dismiss the complaint for that reason. Questions, comments, or concerns?
We did receive a supplementary response from DPS where they looked at the underlying information that was submitted and the chain and everything, and it all, there was nothing irregular that raised any sort of red flag for them. And Greg Hilbig is here, and I think you looked at it, and also Brady Mills.
Is there any discussion? Is there a recommendation? Well, the recommendation, is there a
I make a motion to dismiss for failure.
second? Second. All in favor? Opposed?
Which brings the third matter, which is item 18.19. This is an anonymous complaint. I'd like to address that. Rick Garcia and I had a discussion, I guess it was Wednesday this week. We don't want to minimize this simply because it had anonymity to it. The commission has received complaints over the years that may have been done on an anonymous basis for a number of different reasons, many of them personal, but this involved a complaint from the DNA analyst at the DPS Capital Area Lab. It involved concerns of management issues and the workplace environment. They've had significant turnover, 5 out of 7 analysts just in the last preceding 6 months. Garcia advised me that presently Travis County and the City of Austin have sought out the assistance of the Quattrone Center for a review of all of this, frankly for root cause analysis. And so my thought is, we don't know what that's going to bring, and there's significant resources being devoted to that effort. It might be appropriate we simply take no action or table this at this time and visit it either at our next meeting or the following meeting, and wait and see what the Quattrone review and study brings, and maybe more, maybe less. Right now, it might be best to wait. Questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, I've been looking at this, and I agree the Quattrone thing is a good way to go. but there's no complaint of any problem in science. And so what are we looking at that we're tabling? To me,
So-
there's no point to this one. I mean, management's an issue in any of these, and I don't know if it's our purview to be in management of it. If the management is affecting the quality of the work, that's there, but there's no accusation that, or allegation that there is any malfeasance in that area, so I don't know why we're holding on to this.
Right, and we've
So-
had complaints like this before that are largely human resource type issues in labs and.
So I can just go down the jurisdictional issues. There are really two areas of jurisdiction that the commission has. One is investigations of allegations regarding professional negligence or misconduct. This is in forensic analysis, and this is not that. The complainant is not saying that any of the forensic analysis has problems. I don't think the laboratory has done very much forensic analysis. It hasn't been stood up for very long. The other area of jurisdiction that the commission has now, which it hasn't always had, but the other area is accreditation. And the statute expressly says that that includes the ability to inspect or audit the records, reports, procedures, or other quality matters of an accredited lab or a lab seeking accreditation. So if the commission were to do anything about this, it would be in that second category. You know, my understanding of the complaint in a nutshell is that the dynamic that is described by the complainant has had some impact on the quality issues, or the quality of the work that's being done there. I don't know that that's actually gonna be substantiated at all. It may not be. It may, you know, none of that may bear out. And so the question about Quattrone really is, they kind of have two jobs. One is they're supposed to do a root cause analysis of APD's DNA lab issues that are historical in nature, and the other thing is that they're supposed to look at what is the best structure for the laboratory going forward, whether that may be keeping it with APD, moving it to a City of Austin lab, like what was done in Houston, doing a county-city collaboration, continuing the DPS MOU, whatever that may be. So I think the thought was that instead of the commission looking at this, you could either table or dismiss it and just send a letter to the city and county saying that to the extent these issues bear on Quattrone's work, they can include them. The folks impacted are already on Quattrone's interview list to begin with. And then if Quattrone identifies any quality matters that would be subject to the commission's jurisdiction, they can always let the commission know that, and the commission can take it up at a later date. I'm not sure, looking at these strategic measures that we've got in the background, that you necessarily want to carry it on the agenda forever, and it's going to take Quattrone a really long time to do it. So one option might be, I mean, I just think, because it's a contract worth over $400,000, and it's extensive. So one thing you might consider is just dismissing it and then sending a letter that just says this is what we're doing, and if Quattrone observes any issues that are worthy of the commission's review, they can always let us know. So that would be one option. But at least that way, it's not just completely, you know.
Sounds like dismissing it without prejudice.
Right, yeah. Because, well, it is definitely true that anytime we get an anonymous complaint wrapped up in that, or a complaint, frankly, from any current or former employee, usually wrapped up in those complaints are some personnel issues that the commission does not get involved in at all. And sometimes that's all it is, and other times there are quality type issues to look at. It just depends. But usually you try to parse those out and do a little bit more inquiry before just dismissing it.
Is there a motion? Further discussion?
I would make the motion to dismiss, and then we can bring it up at a later date if Quattrone never finds anything. Because I think Dr. Joe is kind of right, like, it's kind of, right now, it's kind of discounted. There's nothing in front of us right now, so we can dismiss, and if they have something else, they can bring it up later, and we'll take it.
And it sounds like those issues are gonna come up as
Yeah.
part of their routine investigation
Anyway.
anyway. So
Yeah.
I think it's better to wait, see if anything substantive comes of it, and then we can tackle it.
So there's a motion, is there a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor? Opposed?
That would conclude our complaints and take us to our disclosures, which we have 5. Item 1811 is a self-disclosure by Fort Worth PD Crime Lab regarding late print section. Fourth examiner found numerous errors in the previous casework by some other examiners. Guess what? They're no longer there. Fort Worth PD is presently in the process of a retroactive review of late print cases. Frankly, it may just be too soon to take the action, so the staff would recommend table to disclose. Table now for later disclosure pending retroactive review. That seems to make sense. So,
They have
question?
209 cases they need to look at, that's a lot.
I'll do anything until then.
Do we have any idea if these latent print examiners are employed at another lab in Texas?
I don't know.
I actually know.
Don't
One is retired, and the other one is no longer in the forensic field.
I'll be entertaining a motion to table.
Second? Oh,
Oh, wait, who made the motion?
yeah, I need a motion, sorry.
Did you make a motion?
I said we should probably
Yeah,
entertain a motion.
sorry, that's what I thought you said you were making the motion.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, Jarvis?
I'll make a motion.
Second? All those in favor? Opposed?
Which brings us to the next disclosure, 1813 by Signature Science. It's contamination of the toxicology lab. Found low level of reagent blanks matching the lab employees. That would not be good. Staff would recommend no further action until there's some disclosure, given the root cause analysis, and find out what corrective actions the lab is taking. So, Lynn, is that taking no action at this time, or table it? What is that?
I don't, Jody can speak to it better than me, she's been working with the lab, but I think they've done everything that they can possibly do.
It's actually a nice workout.
Yeah,
They
it's
did a really good job.
It was isolated to
Mhm.
the PyCube, one instrument. They did a good job.
They did really good root cause analysis, and the corrective actions were very appropriate, so I don't think anything else needs to be done.
So the recommendation is no further action. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second? All those in favor? Opposed?
And then that brings us to the next self-disclosure, 1814 by DPS Westico. Came out of their forensic biology unit, had incongruous acid phosphatase, testing results were observed during a reanalysis casework as part of the quality assurance process. It's probably too early to do anything, so staff has made a recommendation to table the complaint until some final work is prepared, and we'll review that and make a decision at that time.
So we since have received their, we were recommending tabling it because we hadn't gotten their quality incident report, but now we do have it, but I just don't think we've had enough time to look at it, considering everything we've been doing preparing for this meeting.
I haven't read it.
So I think maybe we could make a call next meeting about this.
Sure. I would move to table 1814 self-disclosure.
Is there a motion?
That's a motion.
Okay, second?
I'll second.
All those in favor? Opposed?
Which brings us to the next self-disclosure, item 1815, DPS Waco. Again, out of their principology section, they received a complaint describing discrepancies in crime lab records and complaining regarding a timeline of events, and they wanted some resolutions of some chronological inconsistencies. Staff had reviewed this extensively. They believe that quality incident report should have been generated for lack of reporting screening under ISO standards. They had recommended discussion with DPS during the meeting. Frankly, I concur with their recommendation. There's probably no further actions required at this time. Thoughts, comments?
Do you want to
we can talk to the laboratory about the issue with the quality incident report for the lack of reporting of the screening results, which under the ISO standards, that should have been done. But I think other than that, there's no reason to carry it over. So we can talk to them offline. I don't think that we need to hold it just to that. I just don't think we've had a chance to talk about it.
No worries. You're gonna talk to them.
All right, so is there a motion to take no further action?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed?
This brings us to item 1818, self-disclosure, came out of Houston Principal Science Center, involved their multimedia section. We had an analyst that documented DVR storage setting and regarding time frames and camera recording settings according to their standard operating procedure. The item ended up being shredded and destroyed the original scene notes. Staff had reviewed this well. There was a recommendation no further action in light of it being an isolated incident, and also the fact that the analyst is seeking some job opportunities elsewhere at this time. So I concur with that. Any comments or questions?
So is there a motion for no further action? Second?
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
And by way of reporting, since our last meeting on February 2, I guess it was, staff has had 4 complaints that have come in that they have received and reviewed. 3 of those were just general questions and actually requests for additional forensic testing, for which we didn't have authority of jurisdiction to approve. Fourth came out of Swifts in Dallas. The fire alarms analyst Heather Thomas was subject to a complaint that we've already reviewed and issued a report, so it was a little bit above it. Those complaints were dismissed and forwarded to the Dallas Public Defender's Office with regard to the Swifts. That's by way of reporting only, if I didn't require any action. That would conclude complaints and disclosures.
All right. So the next topic is the status of crime laboratory accreditation program.
So the first item you have, as you might recall, the commission finds out about crime laboratory nonconformities one of 2 ways, either through affirmative reporting when there's an issue of potential negligence or professional misconduct, but also the laboratories are required, because of the accreditation side of the jurisdiction, to copy the commission on any substantive communications with the accrediting body. So now, every time that we meet, we include a summary of what those things have been. And the way we go about it is we get those in, and a staff thinks that they're rise to the level that you need to discuss it separately under complaints and disclosures. We do that, but if not, they are just in this memo here. So did you all have a chance to look at these? Does anybody have any questions about any of these items that came into us? They're pretty self-explanatory. No.
Yeah. All right. Okay, we need to go over the AG's opinion regarding postmortem toxicology.
So y'all might remember that we submitted an AG opinion, and they turned it back to us exactly on the day that it was due 6 months after we gave it to them. Because we always send them these really complex issues, so I feel kind of bad. But postmortem, so when we set about creating the licensing program, that probably more than anything the commission's ever done really engaged the laboratory community. And some feedback came in very early on from laboratories that only do postmortem toxicology. There aren't many. Most laboratories that do postmortem tox also do other types of toxicology, but there are some that are limited to postmortem toxicology at the direction of a forensic pathologist. And so the argument about about that statutorily is that it actually doesn't fit the statutory definition of forensic analysis, because it is not an evaluation, an expert examination or test of physical evidence for the purpose of connecting the evidence to a criminal action. Rather, the main purpose of postmortem toxicology in the vast majority of cases is a medical diagnosis. It's basically a request by the pathologist to test the blood for the purpose of assisting that pathologist in making determinations in the autopsy report that they need to make as part of their medical practice. So the argument then was, well, then the law doesn't apply to postmortem toxicology. It may have a secondary purpose, which is that some of those reports ultimately end up being used in criminal actions, but the primary purpose of it is medical practice. So we put that question in front of the AG, and their answer to us was basically, well, you get to decide. So that's what the law says, and you can decide on a case-by-case basis what the primary purpose is, or you can do a rule making under your rulemaking authority to determine whether you want to exempt, or, you know, to set an exemption if you want. So just me as a lawyer reading the statute, I think there is a good argument that postmortem toxicology is, the primary purpose is the practice of medicine. I think y'all can decide what you want to do in the form of rulemaking. I will tell you that it would be really, really difficult for us to assess on a case-by-case basis whether any particular medical examiner or forensic pathologist asked for the test because, you know, what their intent was behind requesting it. Now, it was pointed out to me yesterday by Greg Hilbig, who's here, who's the chair of our licensing advisory committee, that sometimes postmortem toxicology requests come in not from a forensic pathologist, but they come in from law enforcement when there's already a criminal action initiated, and the purpose of the test is from the outset clearly for the, you know, to determine the connection of that evidence to a criminal action. So there are folks who have actual experience on this subject, so I'll turn it over to you, but I just wanted to lay the legal foundation.
To me? Okay, well, I'm really uncomfortable with the idea that we would exempt post-mortem toxicology and treat it very differently from human performance toxicology. And I think one of the things you said is really critical, that although the AG's opinion clearly says it's the purpose of the examination, not the ultimate outcome, you said in the vast majority of the cases that's why we're performing the analysis, but not all. And I don't think in terms of our regulatory oversight, we can adjudicate on a case-by-case basis. And because even a small fraction of those cases can involve criminal actions, I think for that reason, the entire subdiscipline of post-mortem forensic toxicology needs to be subject to accreditation and licensing.
Are the lab processes different
So
by the different contexts?
And you could also make the argument that in fact, if you ask anybody who's run a lab that does human performance and post-mortem, that they will probably tell you that in fact the post-mortem forensic tox that we do is inherently more complex than the ante-mortem tox. And for that reason, it just would be counterintuitive to exempt post-mortem tox, which might be more complex than human performance tox. So aside from the fact it sort of sets a precedent of creating a double standard for work that is very, very similar. So.
My only concern is, and this is, you know, we deal with death cases all the time, and we get the postmortem talks all the time. Is that done at the medical examiner's office, or is that done somewhere else? Or is that place where it's done, is it accredited
Yeah, it's done
at the medical examiner's office?
sometimes.
It can be done in any one of
anyway,
those situations.
sometimes.
Which is exempt from all of these, am I right, the medical examiner's?
The odd, yes, the MEs are not subject, no forensic pathologists are subject to commission accreditation.
But the toxicology sections in the ME labs are accredited, right, Doctor?
That's the question I have.
Yeah, it depends on who they're accredited by.
Yeah, they're accredited by the Forensic Science Commission currently.
Oh, right.
So I guess, part of the challenge with this though is that we have to look at what the statute says. And we have to not go beyond that. So, the law says an expert examination or test conducted principally for the purpose of scientific research, medical practice, civil or administrative litigation, or other purpose unrelated to determining the connection of physical evidence to a criminal action. If the postmortem toxicology folks that work primarily for forensic pathologists say this is an expert examination or test conducted principally for medical practice, and it's just that sometimes, occasionally, the results of those expert examinations or tests make their way into a criminal action depending on facts and circumstances. I don't think that legally we can say that it's included if the law says it's not.
Right, but sometimes but the purpose of it is to identify a criminal act. I mean, if you've got a drug overdose and you've got somebody who's hospitalized and there's an allegation that there's poisoning, I mean, sometimes from the very outset, we know that there could likely be a criminal action. And I'm not sure how the commission would differentiate as casework comes in between those types of cases that are clearly tied to a death that involves the possibility of a criminal act and a potential criminal investigation from those that are more routine.
And, you know, the medical examiners, those who that are in the medical examiners' offices, our requirement is to determine the cause and manner of death. The manner of death means is it suicide, is it homicide? So it's an investigation from the beginning. I can understand why certain offices don't want to go through the whole effort of doing it. I mean, I certainly understand that. But, you know, you don't want to also subdivide if you're doing human performance testing in a certain section. Well, if you got those people licensed and then the other people in the lab are not going to have to do that, and then you want to transfer someone in, now you got to go through all this. Our office is going to, the whole lab's going to get a license. You know, the legal part of it, we have to rely on the lawyers about that. I think it's a little short-sighted in some respects in that if you're only doing medical examiners' analyses and then a political subdivision, commissioners, whoever, says we want you to do this, then all of a sudden now you have a lab that at this point, when you don't have the same issues with the academic criteria, and then later you now have to do it and certain people are no longer they're going to have to take courses when now they could get it done. But again, it seems this is more of a legal interpretation more than anything else. Like I said, I think it's a little short-sighted. I also am not sure how it will go in the courtroom, and certainly the prosecutors and defense attorneys can ask or maybe can respond. That is, if you go in to testify and you've now got a homicide case from a poisoning case, and you know somehow just saying, well, I don't have to be licensed, maybe that will get you through, but it certainly seems like you're going to take a beating on the stand for that versus, yeah, we took the test, I'm licensed, and that removes a whole line of questioning. But again, I'd have to depend on the prosecutors and defense attorneys as to how they see that.
It's almost more of a strategic as opposed to a legal call. I mean, you're right, if you don't have to be licensed, then...
Well, I can't blame them for not wanting to do it.
Right. It's interesting because the argument for kind of like a blanket coverage and making it all fall under the commission would be that you don't know, in some instances, it would be unrelated to determine the connection of physical evidence to a criminal action. It just seems to me that the way that the law is set up right now, the majority of these things are essentially to determine the cause of death in terms of just a regular old...
But it's also manner of death too. Manner of death is where it goes from being they died from a heart attack to the manner of death is natural versus, well, they also had cocaine on board and then it ends up in court because they're prosecuting the person who provided cocaine. Well, you know, the cocaine drives the manner of death away from natural.
But the original purpose of it was just...
Determine the cause and manner of death.
Right, in those cases, but there are cases where from the outset, there's clearly a criminal element. And I think the critical, there's a sentence in the summary from the AG's opinion, it says, such purpose depends on why a medical examiner or forensic pathologist requests the analysis, not how the results are used. And because sometimes it is requested for the purpose of a criminal investigation, although they are making a call on cause and manner of death, it is part of an ongoing criminal investigation. I don't think that we can differentiate on a case-by-case basis when we have regulatory oversight.
We can't differentiate case by case, but we can't exceed our authority in those cases where that is not the purpose. And that's what I'm
Because the
just
opinion
really
basically is
cautious
saying
about.
it's a
The
case by
opinion-
case,
it-
basically
we would
a
be-
case by case basis.
The commission would be exceeding its legal authority if it wrapped in those cases that are not, that are clearly not subject. That's the challenge.
I get that, and so if we swing the pendulum the other way and we say because the vast majority are not about criminal investigations, they're more routine investigations, then we are in fact not subjecting those that are
Right.
to the law either. So,
That's true, that's true.
You know,
So
that's the other way to look at it.
So the rulemaking would have to get a little more specific than, in order to really hit what I think you're saying you want to hit in terms of the right balance, we would have to get a little more specific in the rulemaking about what types of postmortem toxicology are exempt. And it would be, then up to the lawyers of these, covered entities to decide whether the casework is covered, that their agency does or not.
And the logistics of this for the lab. So I'm thinking, let's pretend we're the lab director and we're providing the the postmortem tox services in these labs, and we differentiate it on a case-by-case basis. Then you have to identify toxicologists or personnel in your lab that can do those cases that might have a criminal investigation element and those that might be more routine. To me, that makes absolutely no sense. But if there are lab directors that plan to manage their labs that way, then we should probably hear from them.
So I have a question. You have a case that comes in and someone has been shot. Cause of death is clearly going to be the gunshot wound, but you're doing toxicology on it. They find there's heroin and cocaine. Well, you're already involved in the fact that is going to be a criminal case. The toxicology is not pertinent in terms of the cause and manner of death. It may go to some other side issues to it, certainly in the defense, and we'll be utilizing that data as well. I don't know whether that then fits into, that would be required, because from the start, it's going to be a case that's going to be a homicide.
It's all about the primary purpose of the examination, the toxicology that you're ordering. What is the primary purpose of that? If the primary purpose is manner of death considered a medical diagnosis?
It's a legal terminology. Justices of the peace in other states, coroners and medical examiners have that authority.
Right.
And that's statutory.
But the forensic pathologist's determination of cause and manner of death is considered medical practice.
Whether physicians or the justices of the peace that are calling them. I mean, the answer is yes, it is medical. Doing the autopsy is a medical practice.
So the challenge is just not, it may be that the practical reality for the laboratories is that they maintain their accreditation and they get all their people licensed, but I really would just caution the commission about writing a rule that violates the statute on its face, that's all.
I have a question.
Why do we need to write a rule at all?
Why do we need to write a rule at all?
I mean, right now, forensic toxicology requires accreditation. And everybody out there that's doing it is accredited. So what does the commission, why does the commission need to write a rule either exempting it or?
So mostly because if there was one area of commentary that we got more than anything else for licensing, it was from postmortem toxicology. People saying that they did not think it should be covered. Now, in that context, they're not so much concerned about the accreditation requirement, because they're all accredited.
Mhm.
It's the
They're two different
licensing.
things.
It's the flow down.
And,
Okay.
and so what, but we can't do one without the other. Accreditation and licensing are tied and inseparable in terms of the disciplines that are covered.
So most of the people now who are accredited at postmortem toxicology, there's not a license for that. So
That's what's in play now.
that's what's important.
And I think Nikki wanted to say something.
Hi, Mickey.
I just wanted to add a piece of information just so everyone's aware. I work at a institute where we have the medical examiner's office and our crime laboratory serves that medical examiner's office. The National Association of Medical Examiners, which is really the main accrediting body for medical examiners, is not required nationally. But our office is, our ME side is accredited by name. Name requires the toxicology lab that serves it to be accredited. And while we only care about Texas, I do know that the majority of ME offices in Texas are accredited by name. So just to look forward, if you want to encourage name accreditation, which we do because the pathologists were kind of slow to get on the bandwagon. Now they're even merging with ANAB to be accredited to ISO standards. I think it would be, I basically agree with Dr. Kerrigan. It would be very forward-thinking and helpful to the pathology community to support that because it feeds into it. So we want to, it's interesting to me that it's part of the name accreditation requirement. So I don't know if that matters too much, but I just wanted people to be aware of that by accrediting your toxicology laboratory, you're helping the ME office be accredited itself. So they're supporting.
And I'm glad that with name moving to having ANAB affiliation, they have no idea what door they have opened.
Exactly, that's another topic. They're not happy about that, but, it's a good, in my eyes, it's a nice step. I think obviously we want to encourage quality in every field, so just thought it's something to consider along with that.
Like I said, we're going to do it for mine. The toxicology lab is within the criminal investigation laboratory, and I know some of them are subdivided where I think Dare County, the toxicology is within the medical examiner's office, and the crime lab itself is separate. But I just think in terms of the big picture, it's just a better thing to do. But whatever the legal decision really is, and I think that's really where we have to determine where we do or don't go.
I don't see where we exceed the statutory language when the AG's opinion says sometimes it does apply.
Sometimes it does, but when it doesn't, we would be
Outside.
outside our jurisdiction. It's
So-
ultra virus.
So if we did exempt postmortem toxicology, those people who have exemptions would have to make sure that they were never involved in any part of an examination or an interpretation in anything that could ultimately become a criminal case.
No, only where the primary purpose of the examination or test that was ordered was
Right, an alleged poisoning. We have
connection to a
Right.
criminal action.
Right.
That would be so it's not, again, it's not that they can't be involved in cases where ultimately there's a criminal action involved, but
Right, but from the beginning, so let's take an example where there's an alleged criminal action, an alleged poisoning, right? Somebody who's close to death and the wife just can't see the husband in pain and maybe she gives him a little bit too much medication. From the outset, that might be a criminal investigation. So does that mean that forensic toxicologist who's involved in that case would not be able to be involved in that case if they're not licensed or accredited? Because from the outset, that might involve a criminal investigation.
not if you exempt postmortem toxicology as a whole. So the reason why we suggested a broader exemption, even though it's a tough thing to swallow, is because from a practical standpoint, we couldn't see how a laboratory could distinguish in the way that you're saying. And because going the other direction would actually violate the statute, we thought that was the only option. I don't know, Jarvis, if I'm not being clear.
I see what you're
Mark.
saying. If you problem is exactly is what you're saying. The difference is the presumption would be to exempt everybody as opposed to cover more people than the law says you have to cover,
Or are even allowed.
or you're allowed to cover.
But you've got forensic toxicologists doing essentially very similar jobs, whether it's ante-mortem and post-mortem, and some of those post-mortem also pertain to criminal investigations, and they would not be subject to licensing or accreditation. But so depending on which side of the grass you're on, you could be doing the same type of work, but some would be licensed and accredited and some wouldn't. That really doesn't make sense.
It may not, but the statute reads the way it does, so what would have to happen is during the next legislative session, they would have to, you know, put something in that code provision that says medical practice with the exception of postmortem toxicology or something to that effect. Because right now, I think if you just say, from a practical standpoint, we can't distinguish, you have to err on the side of adopting a rule that doesn't
It's least
violate the
restrictive.
statute rather than erring on the side of one that does violate.
So here's a parallel. So in my world, say with the sexual assaults, and then we collect labs that go to the hospital laboratory versus labs that we send to DPS maybe for toxicology report. Can the attorneys tell me, how do you view those labs that were done at the hospital? I mean, we're not gonna go into every hospital now and require them to be licensed and accredited, right? But can you bring those hospital labs, how are they viewed in a court of law in terms of criminal investigation versus the ones that we send to DPS?
It's the same analysis.
So they're admissible, the ones that were in the hospital?
The hospital ones are admissible.
Very much.
It's a little different. Yeah, it's a little different.
You know, the other thing is that, under the law, a justice of the peace who's not a physician, maybe there's a few out there, but I doubt it. There may be a few. But they rule on the cause and manner of death, and since they're not physicians, so it clearly is not just the practice of medicine. The autopsy for sure is. And the justice of the peace could technically draw blood or have someone draw blood, send it off, run that toxicology, and that's been done, and make a ruling based on whatever the results are. So I don't know what that throws into it, because it's not just physicians that are involved in this.
And you're saying they would be doing that, not necessarily in just the context of a criminal action, but just to establish cause and manner.
Right, under statute, they have the authority to do that. In fact, if we do a case for another county, we'll give our opinion as to the cause and manner of death, but they ultimately can change whatever they want. So I don't know, in their ordering it, what does that change, if anything? Like I said, running the test is not just the practice of medicine. It's fulfilling a statutory obligation.
So in that circumstance, it wouldn't be the practice of medicine.
Right, and so that's what I'm saying here. If you're trying to argue that, or not you, but I mean, if the argument is that running the toxicology is the practice of medicine, it's not always the practice of medicine, but it's utilized for the same legal obligation in determining cause and manner of death.
So all I would say, and I don't know the answer to this, all I would say is that the forensic pathology, the pathologist, and it's primarily Travis County ME and Bear County ME, what they have said is that the toxicology is ordered by a physician, medical examiner, forensic pathologist, and that is the practice of medicine, and they are absolutely adamant about that. I mean, you're a medical doctor, so you know better than me.
In those offices, that is true. They are the ones requesting it.
It seems to me that the nature of the opinion lends itself to a case-by-case analysis. I mean, that's the nature of the opinion. It's saying, literally, for this purpose, it's this. For this purpose, it's this. And sometimes it's exempted, and sometimes it's not. The problem is that, I see what Lynn's saying, if you make a rule, you're then almost over-regulating, because sometimes this is absolutely exempt. Now,
Or you're under-regulating.
Or you're
Where you allow people who are doing forensic tox
right.
for criminal investigations not to be subject to those requirements. And I don't see how that is not in conflict with the statute either. So
Or
we're
that-
damned if we do, we're damned.
Or there's a line in between that says some of them are walled off. And impact of that is going to be, like Dr. Bernard said, is that everybody is going to become accredited and licensed.
And then it goes away.
But what the actual opinion is saying is that it's on a case-by-case basis, which doesn't give us any guidance other than the fact it just kind of leaves a patchwork.
So if it goes to court, goes in a trial, and defense attorney challenges that, that's apparently where it's gonna shake out.
Then you would have to have
Well, that's the other
a
thing.
hearing on it.
This goes back
Yeah.
to Pat's point. Don't write a rule at all and let the courts
Judicial system.
work it out. They'll be very grateful, I'm sure, to us for that, but let them work it out on a case-by-case basis. That would be the other way to do it.
Well, if we ever wanted a legalese response, we got it from the Attorney General.
Yeah, it doesn't put us in any better
Yeah.
position. So, I mean, it's like Dr. Karen, her point is absolutely right.
Yes.
It doesn't, the opinion doesn't put us in any better legal position either way.
And when we proposed an exemption, it was just because it was the only thing we could think
Yes.
of that wasn't gonna put us in, overextend the commission in terms of statutorily what it's allowed to do. But if you leave it alone, as Pat suggests, the courts will work it out.
So then it would be up for the laboratory to decide they don't think it's needed, and then they just find out in a trial, and then it goes from there.
And when you say leave it alone, you mean not amend not recommend the
Do
rules?
nothing.
Yeah, do nothing, do not put it in.
And then the lawyers will make the argument.
I have, and my wording may not be quite correct when I say this, but do we have a question as to the state of Texas as to how many of our post-mortem toxicologists are either not in an accredited laboratory? But that's the first question, and I'm assuming that none of them are there is no licensing procedure
Yeah,
for
no.
post-mortem tox right now.
None of them are licensed, some may be certified. I don't think there are people, I could be wrong, but they're all accredited.
So they're all in accredited labs. The only question now is, do all those people now have to become licensed?
So that's the
That's
next
the question.
question.
That's
And in fact, we have a lot that took the licensing exam.
Because
that
they
don't want to be
thought-
subject to this.
They took it anyway, but.
I mean, that, I think, is where the split is with the, how many in a normal, or I mean, obviously labs are all different, but are there toxicologists that just do post-mortem and just do anti-mortem? There's toxicologists that do both. I mean, so it's
And I would
a
like to
mixture.
know that.
So,
Is that normal that you only do post?
so if you're doing anti-mortem, you're gonna be licensed anyway, so you can do both.
So Bear County, so the main labs that have raised this issue are Bear and Stratus. Bear currently does both. They still do DUIs and postmortem tox, but they want to move toward just doing postmortem tox. And Travis County just does postmortem toxicology. They don't take any other types of toxicology at all. So they would be the ones that would have to look at this opinion and make a call for themselves and then not get licensed. And then if a lawyer challenges it, the judge will make the call. That would be the way to do it.
Well, it'll shake itself out,
Yeah.
sure, one way or the other.
And then just the way I read the opinion, if police officers call, say, Travis County Medical Examiner's Office, and say, we want to test, we believe that this is a poisoning, can you please do toxicology on this, on postmortem tox on this? That would be for the purpose of the criminal action, and that person would then have to be.
Well, that would be part of investigation in which the medical examiner is taking investigative information, and then they are doing their examination, including toxicology, and then they're still ruling on the cause and manner of death. I don't know that, I mean, that happens in every single case that's reported, so that doesn't change anything.
I'm just trying to find a hypothetical where it
Yeah.
would be, it would fall under this exception, so.
Well, I mean, we've had cases that I think that, in particular, I did one where there was someone who had not qualify as a reportable case, but for the family's allegation that she was poisoned. Did the autopsy, she surely was poisoned, and that went to trial, and there was a conviction. But reporting investigative information, what medications are they on, what the family alleges, that's a day-to-day in the medical examiner's office. So the police calling would be a routine thing. And so from my perspective, we're always, every case is an investigation, you know, whether, and is a criminal investigation just because it's under the statute of what we do. But in terms of how this law is written, if that really doesn't see it that way, then that's a whole different point. Again, we're going to take a different approach, but your specific point of if the police call up and say, well, there's this possibility or there's this medicine is missing, that's on a day-to-day basis at an ME's office.
So in the idea where there's an allegation of poisoning here from the family, in your experience, we're talking about 5% of the casework, 10% of the casework?
No, I think it's probably, I think it's less than that.
Less
I
than
think,
that.
but there are cases whereby a lot of times they are cases that are reportable if they're deaths at home, that say they're dying of cancer. And so you're going, you know, this is an expected death. And then the family says, we think somebody poisoned them. Well, then you gotta bring them in and do the examination. And do your interpretation. But it's the medical examiner making the interpretation again as to the cause and manner of death. I don't think that changes anything. That's our routine practice.
So I think if you were the Travis County ME's office and you did a range of things, a few poisonings and a whole bunch of other stuff, your argument would be, I don't have to get my people licensed because what we do here is all at the direction of an MD, licensed forensic pathologist, and so this part of the statute, I mean, look at the AG opinion and look at the statute, this does not cover our office, and so we don't need to be licensed. And that will be the argument, and the judge will look at the statute and they'll interpret the statute, and there'll be a ruling. For most of our laboratories, they're doing a blended set of toxicology analyses. They don't even necessarily always know what it is what the background is. They're just doing the testing and sometimes they know and sometimes they don't. I think that's
And the AG's opinion clearly says sometimes on a case-by-case basis. And if we were to swing the pendulum the other way, we would then not be subjecting those that are doing post-mortem tox for criminal purposes to licensing accreditation. And that would just simply be wrong, not to hold them to the same standard as those that are doing the same types of tests on living subjects.
Yeah.
Philosophically, that's just a bad approach.
I think it'll get decided by somebody else. Is there, do we need to make a motion as to whether we take no action?
Yes.
Okay, so is there a motion that we take no action, or someone want to make a motion differently?
I'll make a motion that we take no action.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
There is another piece of that, and that's the workplace drug testing.
yes,
That we
need
have
talk about
to,
that.
and that's in the same, drafted in the same rule, we can just mark out.
Right, so in addition to the folks that do postmortem tox, we also had outreach from laboratories that do workplace drug testing, urinalysis basically, and every once in a while, occasionally, a prosecutor will then use the results of that in a criminal case. We were thinking that that should be exempted because it is according to, I mean, these are places like LabCorp and Quest Diagnostics and places like that. But I throw it out to y'all for discussion.
Let me ask a question about that. Since the statute specifically, the accreditation specifically addresses physical evidence involved in a criminal action, probably 99% of workplace drug testing is not a criminal action. It's an employment action. So doesn't the statute already sufficiently address that?
So you could certainly make the argument that it does, but I think for clarity, what these laboratories are asking for is some clarity through a rule. So like, for example, what the AG tells us in the postmortem toxicology context in this opinion, which is the reason you have rulemaking authority is to provide clarity and to address practical issues in implementation. This would be a reason to do that, because they know that occasionally their tests end up getting used in a criminal matter. So I knew that the postmortem toxicology piece was gonna be something really needing discussion, but I'm just not sure for work. I think if they're asking for the rule and there's no reason,
I don't have a problem exempting them, but I would recommend a small change on the wording where it says workplace/workforce drug testing, just to workplace/employment drug testing.
Okay.
So is there a motion for making that change and exempting workforce employment drug testing?
I'll make the motion.
Second?
I'll second.
All those in favor? Opposed? So we want specificity for employment testing and we want obscurity for postmortem.
Okay, so the next, is there anything else in on that one?
Just, the other piece of this is, on this agenda item, is that we published our blood stain pattern exemption, and it takes effect on May 24th. So blood stain pattern and shooting trajectory and crime scene reconstruction, we just made some clarifications there, will be exempt for a period of 1 year, and then we'll publish a new rule that removes the exemption.
And I talked to Major Huck yesterday, who's one of the rangers who's in charge of trying to facilitate this process. And the rangers have invited us to Waco to participate in some training that they're doing and to have a conversation with them. We had a really great conversation. I think what the rangers are seeking is some clarity on the line between some very not complex work that they do in terms of coming to the scene and doing the collection of the patterns and some pretty basic identification versus some more complex work that you might see, for example, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office doing. They have some people that are engaged in that work that's more sort of fundamentally scientific, but a lot of the people that they have are doing work that I think is closer to the crime scene collection side, and I think their request is that we consider, what we don't want to do is make a rule a year from now that has unintended consequences on not only the ranger's ability, but the ability of other law enforcement entities to do the crime scene, the fundamental crime scene work. So we're going to talk, when we go up to Waco, about how that rule might look a year from now when, as the commission decided that it was going to bring blood stain pattern analysis back into accreditation in a year. But for now, once the rule has hit the 20 days, all those areas that Lee just mentioned are exempt.
What day is the Waco? It's like early May, is that right?
It is, it would be great if you could go, Jonathan.
I think I got an email from someone.
Troy, since you're what's his name?
Maybe.
Tuesday.
I got an email from maybe a Commander Huff, maybe.
Yeah.
TDCA.
Major.
Oh, there's Major Huff.
There's a bunch of them.
Major Huff, yes. So I'm trying to put my calendar so I can-
It would be great if you could. But
Yes.
Jody and I are gonna go and sit down with them and, because, you know, some of it is just that we don't know what the rule will look like, and so there needs to be a consideration for the practical implications. But for right now, the discipline's exempt, so exempt is exempt.
There was a clear difference between collection versus interpretation. As soon as there was interpretation involved, it crosses that line. Is what we were discussing earlier, in terms
Right.
of duties that could be done at the front end, instead of all collection and documentation.
From speaking with Major Huff, there are some basic functions that I think they would like to see permanently exempt. I think he understands and appreciates that some of the more complex analytical work would be appropriate. I mean, they're moving toward accreditation already. We have someone from Montgomery County Sheriff's Office here. Do you want to tell us a little bit, Shelley, about your experience moving the laboratory toward accreditation? Because you've been doing that now since our last meeting.
Yes, ma'am. So we were able to complete our SOP and as well as our training manual. Those were submitted to Ms. Kaler because of the partnership that the commission agreed to help us make sure that the process was expedited, so we were able to complete both manuals. They were submitted to Ms. Kaler. She actually provided feedback on the training manual with some recommended changes, of which we took into consideration. We made those changes. It was submitted back to her for her review. She's in the process, I believe, reviewing the SOP. We are planning on starting our casework. We've been in communications with ANAB, with the lead forensic accreditation person there. Kind of enlightened her on what bloodstain looks like, because this is the first time ANAB of them taking over from Asplad Labs, and so we'll be the first true agency that ANAB gives a bloodstain accreditation to, and not just the adoption from Asplad Labs. And so they are actually changing their scope this week to include the reconstruction aspect, so that you can make those conclusions, the opinion-based conclusions. And so that's gonna be, their scope is actually gonna be updated. We are planning on starting our casework under this training, or under this SOP. June 1st is kind of what our date is. Our kind of projection is that will all be complete, the reports will be done, and we'll be ready for assessment by August or September. And so our anticipation is that we will have a bloodstain accreditation before the end of the year. Yeah, Laurel Farrell is the one that has been helping
Yeah,
us
Laurel's
with ANAB.
You have the right person.
Yeah, she's been
She's very
fantastic.
thorough, and she will help you get there.
And she had great questions, and you know, she was under the impression that bloodstain was just, we go to the scene, we say, that is an impact pattern, that is a drip trail, that is cast off, the end. And I'm like, no ma'am, that's, it's a little more robust than that. And so in our communication, she's like, oh, well then we need to add reconstruction into the scope. So she was making notes, and then Stephanie Lure is our quality manager, and Stephanie was able to talk to her and visit about, you know, kind of what the scope should look like, and so I think we're set.
All right. So we will report back to you after we meet with the Texas Rangers in Waco, and hopefully, and anyone who would like to go, they invited everyone. So anyone who'd like to attend, you're welcome. Just let me know. And is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Ranger Wilson? No? Okay. Yes,
We're, so I had tendered a question about an assistance from maybe DPS on the swabs, the DNA swabs. And so I didn't know if the commission had an opinion about that, since we have lab directors in the, if there was an avenue in order to expedite these cases that need to be worked.
so they need sample cases in order to meet a certain part of the, or samples to, right? Is this, I'm saying this right? Like in order, part of the accreditation, you know.
So you just need mock.
Right.
Well, and
Mock samples.
It's not gonna be mock casework, it's gonna actually be cases that, not huge cases, not capital murder cases, or, you know, hopefully it's gonna be just an assortment of cases like an aggravated assault, domestic violence, maybe, you know, burglary of a habitation where the offender is cut. But in order to do a bloodstain report and provide conclusions, we would need the DNA results to say, this blood is the victim, this blood is the offender. And through the course of just regular submission, we may be on a wait time of 9 to 12 months in order to report those conclusions, of which we don't have that kind of time. And so I was asking if we could have some kind of not to overwhelm DPS with 100 swabs, but just maybe that we could have some favor to expedite those swabs so that those reports can be done, so that we can get our assessment and get on track.
this is your active case where you needed a more expedited timeframe so you can interact with your body.
Yes, sir. And we're looking at, we're able to use some of my more recent cases, like the case that the commission has. And so we're looking at only 3 to 5 cases.
Yeah, bring something to work with you.
Thank you, sir.
We'll take a break before we start the next one.
Let me take a look and make sure that, is there anything else on that one? I just wanna make sure we get up through, yes. Yeah, we could take a break before.
Take 15-minute break. 2:05.
Got it on the counter.
All right, the next issue, number 5, is discussing the licensing advisory committee program.
Here it is, right here.
So, I think probably the best place to start would be actually this presentation to talk about the licensing exams, because that's the issue that I think most people are concerned about right now, and then we can go and back and talk about, a little bit about some rule changes, that were made in response to comments that came in. So, this is an update essentially focused on the pilot exam phase, some things we learned during that phase, and some things that we're going to be doing to address some comments. Greg Kilby is here. He's the chairman of the Licensing Advisory Committee. So Greg will be helping me, and Dr. Schneider, who's also on the Licensing Advisory Committee, is here as well. Do we have any other members? I think those are our two representatives. So the pilot exam was open from March 15th to April 13th. I just want to take a minute here to really thank Lee, because she worked extremely hard to help people sign up. We had 358 people, then she managed the entire process. She managed through technology glitches and issues with people's browsers and all sorts of things, and it was nonstop, and she really did an amazing job. So so we had 358 examinees, and the test had 140 total questions. Of those, the idea was that 40 would be eliminated, and the final set of questions for the next iteration of the exam will be 100 questions. So we started out with a lot of extra questions. In retrospect, I'm not sure we would do it that way again, but that's the way it was done. It does give us a lot of room to make revisions, so that is the upside. So now we're in the period where we have the option to respond to feedback, and by feedback I mean both the data that has been collected so far, that the psychometricians will use to make recommendations, but also the feedback that we've received from the community. So the scoring of the test will be based on 100 of the pilot exam are going to be based on the 100 best performing questions in the group. So just to give you an idea of some information that we've gathered to date, this is the chart that shows generally the main disciplines that took the test: DNA, firearms, seized drugs, tox, and trace. What percentage of the whole population those disciplines comprise? So just under half of test takers were DNA analysts, 21% were seized drugs, 18 toxicology, and then we had much smaller groups in both trace and firearms. And the reason we put this here is because it gives us a good place when we're looking at how people performed and the data that I'm about to show you. We can look back and see, as compared to the whole, are people over or underperforming depending on their discipline. So these are the breakdowns in terms of the quartiles. So these first two show the top 2 quartile performances. So as you can see, this is your top 25%, and just under half were DNA, 24% were seized drugs, 9% were firearms, 8% trace, and 10% toxicology. So looking back, what you see is that the DNA folks were pretty much right on target as their representation, the overall population. Same thing for firearms and trace. Seized drugs, analysts slightly overperformed, and the toxicology group slightly underperformed. If you look, now it's not a huge sample because the top quartile is only 87 people, but that just shows you the breakdown. And then you'll see here in the second quartile as well that the toxicology group picked up a lot of ground here, and but interestingly, these ones stay fairly consistent until we start, the disciplines themselves are staying consistent. It's when we get to the years of experience where you're gonna notice some differences. So here's the data that went into those pie charts and a couple of additional points. So in your top 25%, the average score was 111 in terms of the number of questions they got right out of 140. The top score on the entire test got 90% of the questions right. So that person answered 126 questions of 140 correctly. And you can see within this quartile where the people fall. Now, when you look at the average years of experience in this top 25%, you'll see that it's about 11 years. In terms of the number of examiners per discipline, there were 18 from seized drugs, 8 from tox, 32 from DNA and biology. So DNA includes biology screeners. 7 from firearms, 6 from trace. The median years of experience in the group was 10, and the lowest was 3 months. So that's the breakdown in the top 25% of test takers. So in the second 25%, you'll see the average score is about 101, and you can see the rest of the data here. Average years of experience was just under 9. The median was 6, and you can see the rest of the breakdown. The lowest years of experience in this second group of scores was half a year. And then as we move down into the third and fourth quartile, you can see a little bit more about the discipline breakdown there. Here's the data for the third quartile. That's the average score was they got about 94 questions out of 140 correct, and then you can see the low and high scores, the average years of experience, the median and the low. Does anyone have questions about any of this as I go? Feel free to interrupt me. Yes?
Just a dumb question, what's the passing score?
We don't know yet. That's something that the psychometricians help us evaluate. And same thing here here's your fourth quartile data. So the lowest score on the exam was someone who got 51 out of 140 correct. The high score in this group was 89, the median was 82. Average years of experience was 6, but the median was 4. So what you can see is that the more junior people are struggling a little bit as we get down into the data. So moving into years of experience, this is how it broke down in terms of the whole group. 35% had greater than 10 years, 20% had less than 2 years, 27, 3 to 5, and then 18, 6 to 10. So that's how it all breaks down. And then as you look at years of experience per quartile, you'll see that in the first group, 47% of the people in the highest performing group had more than 10 years of experience. 23% had 6 to 10, and so on. 9% had less than 2. So if you go back to their overall representation, you can see that they underperformed in the very top group, the under 2 years of experience. So these are some things that we take into consideration as we figure out how to move forward with the test questions and how to adjust them to the community that's going to be taking the test. Same thing for the second quartile. You can see how it breaks down. Here in the second group, you can see that the more junior examiners are performing better here than they did up here in the top. And this right here, the second quartile of test scores looks pretty close to the population as a whole. And then you can see as well here, as we start to go down, the people who are struggling sort of at the bottom of the performance group includes a fair number of people who have less than 2 years of experience. So we want to take that, as I said, into consideration. And then there's a question about, digging into this a little bit more deeply. How did newer analysts perform? So shows you that those with less than 5 years of experience, that's how that group broke down as a whole. And this is how the folks with less than 2 years of experience broke down as a whole. So you can see here, half of them ended up sort of down there in the bottom. So we need to sort of adjust for that. So here are the median scores per quartile. Up at the top, it's 110 of 140, and then you can see, the nice thing about this is there's not a huge swing in between the top and the fourth. So that means that with some adjustments, we think we can really improve the test. Here's just interesting information about the top 20 scores. So this is the highest performer on the exam. But if you look here, in some of them we just didn't get years of experience data for, and we're actually going to go back to the labs and ask them again to give us that information. Some of them were sort of giving us their list of pilot test takers at the last minute, so we didn't get all the data. We're going to try to fill it in. But you can see, for example, the third highest performer only has 3.5 years, and there's some folks in here with 4.5 or 4 or 5. So not everybody in this top group has, decades and decades of experience. So it is possible to score well on the exam with limited experience, but by and large, the people who are struggling are the more junior people. Now, having spoke to the psychometricians about that a little bit, they said that is to some extent to be expected. You would hope that you would write a test where the people with more experience will generally perform better, but you don't want it to be skewed too far so that the more junior examiners are really struggling. That's going to be especially the case after January 1 when the first classes come in, and then we're looking to the next class, which is going to be primarily all new folks, so we need to take that into consideration. And again, here is a breakdown between the years of experience for the top 20 scorers and their disciplines. We had a lot of seized drugs folks in that group. To talk a little bit about the next steps for the exam, and this is from the perspective of the psychometricians that we retained, who've been excellent. They've been really helpful, and they have done a lot of this work. And they said the next thing we're going to do is turn toward item analysis. And by item, what we mean is questions, right? So we're going to determine which items performed well and which ones did not. And for that, we are extremely grateful to have Brian on board, because he's really digging down question by question, answer by answer, to see where people are struggling, whether it's a poorly framed question or a distractor answer that is that is sort of throwing people off, because we think there are some of those in there. So we're going to be analyzing that. We'll see exactly how many examinees got the answers correct and where they went wrong. The weighting for the exam that was originally selected was what's here. It's pretty evenly divided. The only one that was less was evidence handling, on the basis that evidence handling is actually something that's trained heavily on in the laboratory, so they should be getting supplementary training on that anyway. Whether or not we change this weighting is something I think that can be considered as we move forward in revising the items. So after taking out the questions that did not perform well, so 40 questions, that's when the pass rate will be set, to answer your question, Jarvis. And that pass rate will be set based on a couple considerations, but some of it is a policy decision. Just looking at the overall group, you see when you look at the data that people performed pretty tightly in a range, the most people did. And so what you're really looking to do is to see the people that did not stay with the pack, so to speak. Now, we want to keep in mind, as the pass rate gets set, that the objective of this exam is not mastery of concepts. It's not to turn scientists into lawyers or anything like that. It is minimum competency in the domains being tested. So one of the things that needs to be assessed, and the LAC has actually made a recommendation to you on this question, is whether to score the exam using what's called a fully compensatory approach, which means that you focus on total performance. So let's just say the passing score is, I hate to throw out a number because people are going to read into that. So it's X. The passing score is X. The question is it okay to just set that passing score at X regardless of how people performed in the 7 domains? You just have an overall score, and if you hit it, if you missed all the questions in one domain, it doesn't matter, you hit it and you're good. The other approach is a conjunctive approach, which requires a minimum, and it could be a very small minimum, but some number of questions right per domain, plus an overall passing score. So it wouldn't be that they'd all be equally weighted in the sense that you have to get half right in every domain in order to pass the test, but it would be, look, you get score of X, total number, but you have to have 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, minimum right per domain in order for you to be considered as having passed. And the reason for that is, I think probably pretty obvious, is that we want to encourage people to take all domains seriously and not neglect any one particular domain. The LAC recommended, I think unanimously, right, Greg, yesterday, that the conjunctive approach is the one that they would like to proceed with and instruct the psychometricians to proceed with. So does anybody have any questions about that, or any reason not to?
I'm guessing that that's also consistent with the advice coming from the psychometricians themselves.
Well, they said we can do it whichever way. There's no right or wrong way. There are advantages to doing it this way, which is that if, one of the things they said, if you're going to set a relatively low cut rate, this gives you some comfort that at least people are paying attention in each domain, that they didn't just walk in cold, take the test and pass it. So that's one of the reasons to do it if you're going to.
Should we wait until we see how these 40 questions weigh out? Because what if the 40 questions are substantially biased to one category? That may suggest there's some other problems. So before you pick an approach, you ought to see how the data play out and how these questions are represented. So if you're just carving out 40, you may knock down a couple of these areas and have nothing to follow up on.
So I think if we were to see weaknesses, and I expect we will, in particular domains on the test, I don't think those weaknesses would be every single question, absolutely. There are always going to be a couple of questions that are so basic that they should be able to get, even if most of the questions in that domain need revision and are,
Yeah, what I'm just saying is it's probably better to wait to make the decision. As I said, somebody made the questions, and from what feedback we got, some of the questions were not necessarily well developed, so you may have a bias in the structure of the questions from the subject matter experts that could drive a particular discipline. So if that happens, you may not be able to fulfill the conjunctive approach well. And I would just wait to see how the questions play out, where you need to fix things and balance before you make that kind of a decision. We just don't have the data yet to know how it.
So if that's true, then there's going to have to be some discretion given to staff or to the LAC to call a meeting and make the decision, because we can't wait until July for the commission to reconvene to make that call. We need to get people their answers quicker than that. That's the only issue.
I think that's fine. I mean,
people need to know. People performed better on the test than they think they did, and they need to know if they passed or not. That is, there's a lot of anxiety right now, and so we need
Those
to
are
help
different
with that.
issues.
What, I'm sorry?
Right now, I mean, you took 140, you're gonna knock out 40, you have 100, and hopefully the 40 that everybody, just by the fact that taking 40 didn't perform well, means you're taking away the ones that people didn't do well
Struggled
on to
with,
start with,
yeah.
hopefully, unless it's really scattered, which may be unlikely. So most of them would end up passing if you said it's just some percent or distribution on that. If you do a distribution, some people fail no matter what. If you do it on a percent, you might have everybody pass. So these are things that I think you should think about before you know that, because I think they need to know, but there has to be an answer to give them. And what's the approach, comes back to those 40 and how they play out.
I think the concern ends up being that if we don't use the conjunctive approach, that people might still be able to pass and fail every stats question that's on the test, on the additional, like the further iterations of that test. And so it was my understanding, and Greg, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the LAC wanted to ensure that there was a minimum passing score for every domain, instead of saying, okay, you got a passing score on 5 of the domains, but you completely bomb stats, so you still get a license.
All I'm saying is, I like data and I like to see data. We're flying blind and.
Oh, no, I hear you, I just.
Based on the feedback we got about the way the questions were formed, we don't know the details of the question. It may be the people who prepared the questions were not properly trained or had the experience to write questions for tests. And as those people may have a strong bias in the results. Until you have that, I just wouldn't recommend you see the data. And leave it to the committee to reassess it.
So we're gonna get into the feedback from the community, and I think we got some great and valuable feedback, and I think there's definitely room for improvement with the questions. I will say though, that the psychometricians did review every single question. There's definitely room for improvement, no question about that. But I do think that if you all want to wait for the data, then I guess my only point is there has to be some discretion given either to the LAC or to the staff to make this decision, because otherwise we can't get people their test results.
I don't know what, I mean, to me, the approach is kind of philosophy is how you pass a test. I don't know if I need the data, if there's a bad question, because I can fix the bad question. If the approach still is, you have to have a base score to basically get where you need to get. So I don't necessarily need to see the data to know that this is the philosophy that I'm going to use to.
There's scoring philosophies really, and that's why when Dr. Kerrigan asked what the psychometricians recommended, they just said these are 2 different approaches that are used, and neither one is inherently better than the other. They just need us to make a call on which one it's gonna be, so that when we're doing our cut, when we're sending the letters out that say, congratulations, you passed, or you're gonna need to retake it, we know what that decision
And
is.
Dr. Badoli, I think your concern's very valid. I think, though, let's finish the PowerPoint. My recommendation is we finish this and go back to this question, because we do have some corrective action, I'll say, to fix some of the questions that are implemented, and maybe after seeing that, you might feel more comfortable that we will be able to come up with a significant number of questions for each area. So it may be best to finish, see what our action plan going forward is, and then circle back to this question.
So just moving on to the feedback, these were the common themes that we heard. One was that the questions were too specific and focused on detail from the readings as opposed to general questions. Another was that the study materials had nothing to do with what scientists do on a daily basis. And I'm gonna go through them all and then we'll talk about each one. Some questions were perceived as unfair because they focused more on excerpts, or because that would have required more memorization, or because the answers were confusing in the sense of like, well, maybe that answer is correct from the perspective of what the author said, but in my lab, my first step would be this, and so that could confuse an analyst about what the right answer is. Too much reading material, the volume was criticized. They'd like to see more PowerPoints and video to set context for new analysts, because a lot of the more senior analysts may have been exposed to concepts about, you know, the Michael Morton Act or human factors type things with respect to cognitive or confirmation bias, but maybe the new analysts, they've never even heard of any of this. So one of the suggestions was more PowerPoints to set context. I think in order to do that, considering the size of our staff, we would have to get outside help, whether that's from the community, from the TACLID, or by hiring people to help us. We would need help to be able to amplify the various, you know, the PowerPoints that we already have. Statistics questions there were missing areas like uncertainty and sampling that people thought they were going to see on there and they didn't. And some questions were awkwardly worded, and the wording, and the point of that is not so much just that it was awkwardly worded, but rather that the wording distracted people from being able to answer the question properly. So that was some feedback we got. A couple of things that I would say, just to provide a little bit of context, is you know, we had written some pretty general questions, the group of people that wrote the questions, and the initial feedback from the psychometricians was that the questions were too general or too easy. And so they sort of challenged us to go beyond that a little bit, and so there's a need to find a balance between getting a lot of comments back like this and making them so easy that somebody could just walk in not having read anything and get the answer right. On the second point here, the domains were intentionally set, right? And I don't know if everybody remembers what they all are, but they're professional responsibility, the Michael Morton Act and Brady, human factors, statistics for forensic applications, expert testimony, and evidence handling, and root cause analysis. And those were selected a long time ago and approved by this commission. Now, we're not getting, you know, there are a lot of people out there that I think understand why we have the domains and are supportive of them, but we're still getting some comments that are like, I shouldn't have to know these areas. And I think, you know, that's a policy call as well. It's not a certification exam. It wasn't intended to be a certification exam. So I think this was a lot of the feedback was focused in these directions. So moving forward, there are some things that we think we can do to address the feedback that we've gotten. So one thing is that we're in a much better position now, because 3 of our LAC members and a number of the TACLID folks have taken and passed the test. And we know that we'll be able to look at this even before the cut rate is set. So, you know, we just know that the people that are performing in the top quartile will be successful. And so the nice thing about that is we can seek assistance from representatives from that group. So the recommendation is that the LAC members who passed, and we're going to try to identify that as soon as we can, plus, and we're going to request some volunteers for the TACLID, plus interested commissioners, and I put Dr. Padoli and Dr. Kerrigan there because they've expressed an interest in helping with the questions. And then we can also invite examiners in the upper quartile with less than 2 years of experience, if their lab directors will agree, to sort of help us with question reframing as needed. Not everybody here has to participate, not everyone has to review all the questions, but at least we'll be getting from people who've already had exposure to the test, feedback and assistance in reviewing them. And I think the way that we were going to go about doing that was essentially assign people question sets that they can work through. They can take on more if they want, but at least if we divide the workup, then people won't feel so overwhelmed that they need to review 100 questions on their own. But the idea being that this approach will help to, number one, integrate the feedback that we've received, and will really get us toward a point where the ultimate question set for the next iteration is representative of, I think, what the community and the people who've taken it already feel is a good, solid test. So that's the suggestion. We'll either tweak existing questions or write new ones as needed. We can work on making some more focused PowerPoints and lectures available, but we are going to need help with that, so we'll seek that out from the community. One comment was to provide some practice statistic questions, because that was the area that I think people struggled with. And then also, we had published some task statements that were written early on as sort of a framework for question generation. But I think a lot of people would like to see us transform the task statement list into a curriculum outline that will assist people with study preparation. So something more akin to a syllabus for a course or something like that, that sets forth those concepts. That's not going to be in place of the reading, so just to be clear, and this is something that Dr. Slider can talk about more if needed, but there was a concern that we don't, it's fine to add PowerPoints and to add an outline, but people still need to do some reading. You don't want to just eliminate the reading. So those are some of the ideas that we've had, and I think we'll be able to, it's going to have to be done relatively quickly, but we can, our first goal is to get people their answer on whether they passed. Having spoken with my colleagues in the agency who run other certification and licensing exams, the quicker we can get that out there, the better, the more quickly the anxiety will also be reduced, because this is unusual in the sense that this is an examination that is being introduced in a community where a lot of people have been doing this work for a really long time already, and so the question is, are you really going to tell me that I can't do this job that I've been doing for 20 years because of your stupid exam, and that's a fair question, is that we want to make sure that we bring that level down. I think people did perform better than they thought they did as a group. So our hope is that with this plan of action, we'll be able to move forward. We had a TACLID representative there yesterday who was very vocal in helping us formulate this, and the LAC is on board, so, question?
Yeah, since my name's up there, we have maybe from different perspective, because I do cases reviewing for the APD issues, or sometimes cases, especially for us. I haven't taken the exam yet. Is this something that means I'm exempted, so I never do worse than my technical leader or something?
That's a good point, Bruce.
Or should I have some special thing where I can take the exam between now and some time frame?
Yeah, I think we'll need to talk about that for sure, because if you, since you do need to take it as a technical review or interpreter, we need to make sure you take it and then start providing feedback after.
So this may be a pedagogical question, or maybe one for the psychometricians, but is there any benefit to learning from the people who didn't do as well? Because you learn something from them that you wouldn't learn from only the people that did well. In terms of question clarity, or...
They have to retake it, so we can't really have them, except for general comments about, feedback about what they struggle with. We can't involve them in the process of rewriting questions, because then they'll know what the questions and answers are.
So that was your rationale,
Yeah.
or one of them.
We have to have people that have been through the process successfully,
They're
and
gonna be
then...
exempted. Okay, gotcha.
Now, they can seek feedback from people in their laboratories who may not have, who may need to retake. But I don't think that they can be in the group that,
That makes sense. Thank you.
Lynn, can you remind me, how long does a person have to wait before they can retake the exam?
there's no wait. It's just all based on, when the laboratory offers the test. So the laboratories administer the test.
But to clarify that, right now, the test isn't available, it won't be available.
It's not available till the,
Right, but when a person, if they do fail, there isn't a waiting period for them to retake the exam?
there's no waiting period. It's just availability of test environments. Judge Harvey?
Lynn, I just had a couple questions. With the bar exam, if you don't pass, there are people at the bar that will go over what you missed. So I don't know, A, if your questions are always the same. If they're not, then if you had a process like that, it may be beneficial because if they missed it, you certainly want them to be skilled in that area. And if you don't have the same questions, then, you know, it wouldn't be a problem for them knowing the questions in the future. But I think they could benefit if they were told what they missed so they can get up to speed on those things, regardless of what the next test incorporates.
Perfect, because you know this.
How do I know this?
Sorry.
I passed the bar the first time. But we have had some people at the court who haven't.
Oh, those people.
Yeah.
That was Mark that
First time, Barbara's gonna answer the question.
Maybe I'll ask you some questions like that next time you're in our court. But anyway. No, but I was just curious about the process.
So our intent, in response to Judge Harvey's question, our intent is for anyone who needs to retake, they will be given an analysis of how they perform so that they can see the areas that they need to focus on and the areas that they did well in. And that way, they're not just sort of flailing in the dark, basically.
We can't get specific questions.
Is the
because we don't
informal,
know
when the end product of it actually, if it does go out, is it going, because it's online, is it going to be instant feedback of what they've got right, or no?
No, we don't have that planned right now, but we may be able to. We just don't have that function set up in Top Class right now.
Is there gonna be a maximum number of times you can attempt to pass the test?
So the rules that were published and the comments, and sent out for comments say that an analyst can take the exam 3 times, pass the pilot, so this one doesn't count. They can take it 3 times, and if they need to take it more than that, they have to apply for special dispensation to take it more. And pay a fee. We would like to minimize the number of times folks need to take this test. We don't want it to be, it's not intended to be as, the bar exam is something that lots of people have to retake, and I think we're hoping to get people through with less agony than what the bar inflicts on folks.
And the results would be private, so it's not like, hey, you had to take it 3 times.
So it's actually, we can't, the law doesn't really allow us to keep it confidential right now. The questions are, but ultimately, if someone were to ask us, get a discovery order that asks for it, or, I need to talk to David Slayton a little bit about the logistics of this in terms of because we're now under the judiciary for public information requests, but ultimately, people's results are not going to be able to be held confidential.
That's on a pass-fail, not that.
That's just, right, we're not going to give information about the questions out, but whether they passed or failed is going to be public. And plus, your licensing status is public, right? So if you don't pass and you don't have a license, that's sort of going to be obvious, I guess, to folks if you're not licensed to.
I was just imagining an analyst being on the stand and them saying, like, you failed the test 3 times or 2 times.
It may happen.
Yeah.
What happens to physicians? How many times you take your board exam?
How many times did you take your
One more. I mean, that happens in this way across the board, but there's data there, like pass-fail, but you pass by a bare minimum, and you have that data. Will that be disclosed if someone got, let's say 60%, that 60% versus a 98? Because if I were trying to bring down the credibility of an analyst, I like to bring up that they barely passed.
So that's an interesting question, Bruce, and I think what I will do is talk to my colleagues in the Office of Court Administration who administer other types of licenses and certifications to see how they handle it.
Pass-fail would be the best way to do this, but
Right.
I can just see that not always end in that way.
I mean, we are not planning to tell people, congratulations, you passed with a score of X. It's just, congratulations, you passed.
I agree with that. It's not,
You need
it's
to
just
retake
the
it.
information that people like. If we should find out what that is, at least prepare them for what may come.
Absolutely, and I think in the conversation about this, we can talk about if there's something that the legislature needs to do to address this in the statute, that might be something to consider during the next session as well. But for right now, the plan is to tell people their results just as soon as we possibly can. And for those folks who will need to retake, give them a place to focus their energy, I guess, in response to Judge Hervey's comment. And, yes,
I
Joe?
have a question. So with this test, and like, let's say you pass 3 areas and you don't pass, say, 2 areas. Do you just come back and do the whole test again, or just those 2 areas?
You do the whole test again. There's no way to separate them out, but you will do the whole test again, knowing which questions you know are the ones that you had a hard time with the first time. If you fail the MBE, do they tell you which areas you, or you just redo the whole thing? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think you redo the whole thing. Does anybody have any?
That's why I said I think.
I think. If, so I think that this is our plan to move forward. And I think with the assistance of the community and their feedback, we will be in good shape. And I think, you know, what the TACLID folks said is we really want to make sure that that this exam, once we move back past the pilot phase, is an exam that our state can really be proud of, and that we can tell the rest of the country we should all be doing the same thing. And so that's always going to be our goal, is to achieve that level of quality so that we can continue to, you know, to feel good about it. Because what we want to make sure is that if you put yourself in the shoes of a laboratory director or the director of an accredited entity, you want to be able to say to your people, you know, this is a possible, doable exam with fair questions if you study. And what we don't want to do is have directors who feel like, well, this exam is flawed and I'm sorry that you have to take it. That's not, we don't want that second one. We want the first one to be where we are. So we will do everything it takes to make sure we get there. Yes, ma'am.
I've got a question about the bullet on new test questions being written as needed. Makes perfect sense to me. Do you have any thoughts about how you would roll that out? For instance, would you have like 105 questions on tests and only 100 would count, and the 5 are just the building up our pool of backup?
Yeah, and one it would be like what you described. I think the ones that can be tweaked to be better questions, we'll just revise them.
Sure.
But the ones that we feel like need to be added, like on the uncertainty section of things, those will be piloted out and they just won't count.
To clarify that process, I believe the plan is to cull the 40 bad questions and then get the review process going through people that are asked to volunteer to help review, to help improve the other 100 questions. So if it's a really bad question, we're not going to waste these volunteers' time saying, hey, can you review this bad question? We're just going to cull it. So it's just going to be the remaining 100 best questions that they're reviewing to try to say, okay, what was confusing about this one?
Yeah, the only thing I worry about that, and that's why I think you need your experts in earlier, is they may be really good topic areas, but the question was bad, and so you call out something that should be critical for their understanding.
And I think
that
that
has to be sort of balanced somehow, I don't know.
maybe that's a good point. I think there are some questions we can all agree are bad, where, well, at least the
So
feedback
I
we
would
got,
look
when it says according to this author, and it's a point that's
I just wouldn't throw out
an
the
opinion.
40, because it's the 40 bad worst performers.
No,
and I
that's
know
a
what
good
the
point.
40 are. Good point, so.
Dr. Slider, did you have?
No, I was gonna say exactly what Dr. Padilla said.
One thing I want to talk about a little bit before we close on this is timing. So I think the consensus from the LAC yesterday is that, you know, originally we were going to try to call the 40 questions and then get the 100 out there for everybody as soon as possible, some point in May. I think the consensus, if we need to retool some questions and move that into June or even the beginning of July, that is better than launching earlier. And part of it is that if you think about it, it's still 5 months that people have. And because my other colleagues in the agency who run certification and licensing programs, they only offer those exams when they offer them, and you have, you know, so when you're crunching in terms of months, it's difficult. But as long as the laboratories have the ability and the flexibility to offer the examination as needed to fulfill, you know, the needs of the lab, I think we're better off. And it's still, according to my colleagues, a long period of time to give people. So I think even if we work on this for a little while longer than we had intended and launch, say in July, that still gives July, August, September, October, November.
Particularly since the reading material is already available.
Right.
We're not adding to it.
Right.
There's some discussion that some of the reading material could end up being removed. I don't know if that's going to happen. We're not adding to the reading material. So if somebody's really antsy and says, I want to start studying now, I'm not going to have time, you can start studying now. So.
To your earlier issue regarding whether or not it's conjunctive or fully compensatory, I don't think the commissioners really have had time to delve into the data to make a determination, but the timeliness is really important. So I would propose that we allow the LAC to make a recommendation and defer to the chair of the commission to approve it, rather than creating any kind of delay.
Okay.
I mean, that would be my recommendation.
Do we need to vote on that, or is it?
I think you should.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll make a motion that regarding those issues, we defer to the LAC recommendation with the approval of Dr. Bernard.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Anything else? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Jasmine?
Yeah, I had a question, like, so, since we had Bruce and Sarah up there and they were supposed to help with the questions, is there gonna be a delay because they have to take the exam before?
I'm not
Sarah
taking
doesn't.
No, she's not.
Oh,
Yeah.
you're not.
It's just, we have an issue with Bruce because he's gonna have to take it. But- And by the way, anyone else?
I think someone should give me an exemption.
Anyone else?
No, I mean,
Yeah,
would
we'll
you-
work.
is there a time I can take the test
Yeah, we'll work.
sooner than later, that's all.
Just get with me and we'll set you up.
All right.
Anyone on this commission who wants to work on questions, you are more than welcome to help out.
I've already begun work on this.
I was gonna ask Pat if he wanted to help out, so but I didn't wanna put anyone up there who hadn't already volunteered, so, those of you who have time available, that would be great.
Just let us know.
Okay, anything, I think we had a comment in the back.
Just a question, and this is purely logistical for taking the exam, but afterwards we did get a lot of questions from our staff about if it's going to be the labs proctoring the exam going forward, even when it's not the pilot, and then if that's the case, technical support. Lee was amazing, but there were needs for technical support, and since we're proctoring it internally, it got a little awkward because it's not a testing center where they have the technical backup right there to help with something, and so we're on the phone while other people are taking the exam. So it puts us in a little bit of an awkward spot. So I think there's just gonna, and maybe we can prep and give them information as we get to, you're taking the exam for real. But how that's gonna operate and what assistance will be there during the exam and how to handle that. Because I know that they're gonna try to fix everything, but it's still technology. And there's a chance that a lab is proctoring it, and it is and should be very strict rules, but then how to handle the circumstances where we have something like that happen.
So, the part of the technical issues that we saw with the website, they've been doing all the bugging and the fixing to try to get those resolved. The plan is to, going forward, that the labs are proctoring this test. After the first class gets through, that'll have to be done a lot less frequently. We had talked about utilizing some form of test center or something like that. I will tell you that in terms of like outside vendors that do test services, even if you combine every license and certification that the entire Judicial Branch Office of Court Administration has, they've looked into this before, and the group is too small in order to be able to do it at by an outside vendor. However, having said that, they do proctor exams here in this building for court reporters, interpreters, guardians, and so forth. So if we get to the point where the laboratories say, we would rather not be proctoring this test, we did it in large part for more for laboratory convenience and flexibility, but if the labs say, we don't want to do this anymore, we can talk about offering the exam periodically here where staff from JVCC, which would be Brian or other people like him, do the proctoring. Meanwhile, for technical issues that may pop up, our hope is that through the pilot exam we learned, well, the software, what do you call them, developers, folks, troubleshooters, learned a bunch of things that they corrected. But like you say, new things can pop up. So we're gonna always try to have somebody available, you know, for technical questions like Lee or Brian, or both. That's the plan for now. I don't know if that really helps much, but
It helps in that we can inform the staff of that. Like I
Yeah.
said, we were just getting a lot of questions and I wasn't exactly sure how to answer them. And if that's what we're doing, and I think like we have the capacity to proctor, it's just going in knowing, okay, this is what we're gonna be doing and how best to plan for that.
Sure. Yeah, the plan is still to proctor internally.
If a lab chooses or elects not to proctor internally, once the tsunami of examiners have gone through and you're dealing with a more manageable number of examinations, it might be nice if there's some flexibility to allow someone to use a testing center, because all universities have them. There are usually nominal fees for doing so, but it might be nice if that's available as an option.
Right.
If you've got one or two people that
Yeah.
elect to do that.
We could definitely look into that.
Would you be okay if like somebody from, let's say I proctored an exam and we just invited some people because DPS had 5 people, that would be okay? Yeah, that happened.
Okay.
Several
That's already
labs, we had
happened,
people
yeah.
would go ticket it.
Some people went
Houston
to other
or-
labs
Yeah.
to be proctored, and it's fine, as long as the proctors sign the certification and they give us the list, and we're auditing all of that and tracking all of it pretty tightly, but yeah, you can combine, and in fact, we suggest that people do that wherever convenient.
And on some of the technical issues, now that we know what they are, we can give more guidance in our instructions to the people that are proctoring it on what to do, so that in some situations, they probably wouldn't even necessarily need to call me or Brian. And they'll be able to resolve those on their own, but we didn't really know what they would be up front. One thing that Lynn did anticipate, which was awesome, was the crashing of the browser, and it happened on the first day that we administered the exam, and because Lynn had thought of that happening, we were able to have several attempts at the exam. We had to tweak the amount of times that someone could log in, and since she thought of that, it ended up working out well, but originally we had it at one attempt, and so it would have been a total disaster had we not
So we
thought
try
of
to
that.
anticipate some things, like, for example, the software performs best in Chrome. So first we had nothing in there about what browser to use, and now we advise people to use Chrome if they can. You know, things like that. our hope is that we won't have anybody with the same technical issues that we had during the pilot phase anymore, because we're paying them to fix those issues. So the hope is that everyone will, I mean, you should have seen Lee, like when the emails would come in, test done, no issues, and she's like, yeah, no issues.
Forward all the positive ones.
Yeah, all the positive ones, because we did have some people who got booted out of the out of the test, and then had to log back in to resume, so that was hard, for sure, because it's stressful.
When it is time to release individual results, will you be able to send like a designated member of management the results as well, or do I need to have 100 people email me every time I take a test?
I think the results should be distributed to the individual, but we can talk
I mean, our
about that.
plan was to notify the individual test taker and not to send a roster to lab management of who passed, who failed. But I think you all can discuss that. It's an individual license, so, I'm just thinking of my experience when I took the bar exam, they didn't send a list to the law firm, but those law firm partners went on the website and checked. And
But
then
we can go check,
yeah, I mean.
You'll know.
Yeah, everybody who passed will be running up with their notice. You'll know who didn't by virtue of not coming up to you, since they have to provide the.
And you'll have to administer it to them again, so.
I know, it's just a matter, no, I mean, it's not a super big deal, we have a lot of people, and I actually, the ones who don't pass, you will not believe how long they will probably wait, or even maybe try to cover up until December.
Can you
By
send
the
out
way,
a notification that the grades are available so that?
there could be
you
an
can look at
issue
that point?
by December.
Well, they have to provide them to the supervisors so that you know who is and who isn't. And it's gonna be.
Can I make
Great.
or if we're wrapping up, I just want to make a couple of comments real quick about
Absolutely.
what, and that's, I know the experience was frustrating for a lot of folks in the community. I appreciate that. I appreciate people stepping up and taking the piloting. I know the whole LAC does, and the whole forensic science staff at least appreciates it. I imagine the board does too. That's not my place to say, but thank y'all for participating and understand we're aware of the issues. We're addressing the issues, and please don't take any negative experiences you had in the pilot and say this is how it's going to be going forward. We are, hopefully people see this today, we're working really hard to fix those issues.
Yeah, it is called we try to remember that it has the word pilot in front of it, but people don't want to have to retake it, I get that, I mean.
All right, the next part is regarding temporary license for Louisiana Lab.
Okay, so one of the issues that we had, an inquiry came in, as you all know, looking at the licensing rules. There is an option for people whose predominant casework is not in Texas, but who do Texas casework, to get a temporary license. It's sort of modeled after the Cohawk Vice license in the legal community. We had an inquiry from a lab in Louisiana that doesn't do a one-off type amount, but they do say 5, each analyst will do 5 Texas cases a year because they're on the border with Texas. And they wanted to know if it was okay to apply for temporary licenses, and we didn't see why it wouldn't be. I don't know if it's the most cost-effective way for the laboratory to approach it, but it didn't seem like it would violate the rules. But I just wanted to ask you all whether or not you had thoughts on that. We have not put a maximum number of cases in the rules that would move you from being able to do a temporary license to having to get the full-blown license. Because we didn't think that you could effectively put a maximum number in there that would really be applicable to all disciplines, because there's going to be higher volume disciplines. It is true that the the temporary license you get for an individual criminal case. But if you're doing, say, 3 different cases for 3 different agencies or 5 different cases and you want to apply 5 times, it's a lot of fees, but it's an option, I guess, right now.
I think until you see somebody abusing that, I
Yeah.
don't think any action would be necessary. I mean, if somebody puts the crime lab, you know, a mile outside of Texas, Louisiana, Florida, for the purposes of doing casework, then the commission might revisit it, but.
Yeah, what the lab manager was telling me was that in that scenario, if they went with the temporary option, they could pass along the cost of the temporary license to the client. And so it would make business sense for them to just do the temporary license every time, whereas getting the individual's license, they wouldn't be able to pass that cost on.
So that was one thing that we wanted to make sure that we weren't giving incorrect information. Federal examiners, if you remember, we've gone back and forth with Ted Hunt from DOJ a few times. The last correspondence was just about the Michael Martin Act and the prosecutors that we had spoken to raising some concern that if the examiners who are subject to certain criteria for disclosure in a federal laboratory may not understand the Michael Martin Act and how it's been interpreted in Texas, especially, or, you know, the disciplinary rules and how they've been interpreted in the Schultz decision and so forth, that you could be in a position where a federal examiner is testifying in a state court case and that examiner may not disclose something that would be disclosable under Michael Morton. And then that prosecutor is gonna be on the hook for having sponsored the witness. So we sent Ted back a letter talking about that issue in particular, and I just haven't heard back from him. I think he's been busy on other things, but I imagine we will speak, and then we can look at the administrative rules and see how to address federal examiners based on subsequent conversations. So I just don't have a rule for you yet, because we haven't connected on it yet. Tech reviewer license. So the issue was brought to our attention that some disciplines and some laboratories need to contract with technical reviewers whose only connection to Texas really is performing tech review for a lab. So an example would be the State Fire Marshal's office, where they have a fire debris laboratory. And right now, they have someone in Florida's State Fire Marshal's office that does their tech reviews. And so the concern is, because of the way the statute is worded, that and it covers technical review, that those people who have literally no other connection to Texas would just say, well, I'm just not gonna do your tech reviews anymore. And that's gonna leave a gap, sort of a hole in their ability to get their casework done. So, in light of that, if you look at the rules that were put in front of you, which are the final version of the last iteration of comments, there is 651 dot, is it 217? Because I don't have mine.
Yeah, it's 212, page 22 of the book.
651.212, page 22. It lays out the criteria for requesting a technical reviewer license. And this license category is based on the statutory provision in 38.01 of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure that says that the commission can create categories of licenses in order to ensure the availability of properly trained and qualified technical reviewers or forensic analysts in general. So the idea being that this rule would address that need. And we've had a couple different people raise it, where they have people doing tech review who have no other reason to be licensed, but that they perform tech review. Questions? Okay, so that's why that rule is in there.
Are these instances where there is no other qualified tech reviewer in the state of Texas, just to put it in context?
So there's situations like with the SFMO, they asked DPS, they asked, and I don't think DPS does 5 degrees, so that's part of the issue. They asked, I forget who else, and the only option they came up with was gonna be a private lab that would charge them. Where the Florida State Fire Marshal doesn't charge them because they exchange work. That's the issue.
Right, but there would be there are other accredited labs in Texas that do 5 degree that they could contract with, but they just don't want to pay for those services.
It would be basically imposing, they don't have the budget.
And is it one person in Florida that's doing all of those tech reviews?
I'm not sure, I don't know.
Because if it's one person in a neighboring state that's doing it, wouldn't the preference be to simply have them licensed rather than change the rules? I don't know.
I don't think that they would go through the full
Yeah, they
licensing,
told
they
her-
just
told
wouldn't do it.
her that they're
They
not
just stopped
gonna do
doing it. And I think Chile has an example as well.
So I'm gonna be in the same boat with that until at least the Rangers get up to speed, and in that my tech reviewers right now are Toby Wilson, who came and presented at the commission, as well as Stuart James, and they're both actually in Florida, as well as the communications I've had with Dr. Slider with having possibly an MOU between Swifts and Montgomery County, but the bulk of doing a tech review on like a capital murder case, I don't want to overwhelm, Mr. Spence on taking that on with his regular casework. So we're actually going to have an MOU with 2 retired bloodstain experts that have agreed to do that, and so that this topic affects me also.
So it's not just fire debris.
No, there are a couple examples. I wouldn't say we've gotten flooded with requests. We've probably had about 3 different examples of this come to our attention. So that's why we created that license category. Now, other than that, the rules that you see that are in this, in your packet incorporate all of the public comment that we got throughout the various times that the rules have been published. If you see, there's this list of things that Lee noted that she changed. One is changing, some of them are simple, like changing biannual to biennial, because you're referring to every 2 years instead of twice a year. Removing blood from all the alcohol references because there's urine as well that occasionally gets tested, so we don't want to be too specific there. Adding the certification body for document examiners to the waiver provision. Expanding the waiver to include minimum education requirements. That was actually in response to a comment that we got from NMS, where they have some toxicology analysts who've been doing the work for over 20 years who don't have 4-year degrees. And so those people were all grandfathered in by the accrediting body very early on. And so we would literally be writing them out of a job if we adopted the rules without a waiver option. I think at the LAC yesterday there was some surprise that there would be any toxicology analysts without 4-year degrees, but apparently these are folks that have been doing this from before that requirement took effect at ASCLD Lab. Does that, anybody questions about that? Okay. We deleted forensic psychology because it's not forensic analysis. It's not the examination, expert examination or test of physical evidence for the purpose of connecting it to a criminal action. We made a clarification about disciplines that may not currently be subject to accreditation or licensing, but later become subject, that for people who wanted to take the pilot exam, that passing that exam would count. if they later need to get a license, it wouldn't be fair to put them through that now and have them have to retake it. A clarification that for people who get a provisional license, the requirements that apply to them are those that are logged in at the time they apply, not the subsequent later requirements. We added language about people who retire or resign that have to come back and testify on cases that they worked before they left. Sometimes folks have to come back, and we don't want to impose licensing requirements just because they're coming back. As long as they were in compliance at the time that the testing was done, then they can come back and testify on those cases. We modified the language about the exam to indicate that those who are taking a modified test because they're technicians, which will be a reduced version of the exam that we're creating, those people, if they promote to analysts, so let's say you have a biology screener who's promoting, they only have to take the sections of the test that they didn't take as a technician. Oh, really important. We had put together knowledge-based competency categories that all the labs were going to have to certify that their training programs covered certain categories. And after some feedback that we got, the LAC decided that it would be good to postpone that until after January 1st of 2019 so that more time can be given to developing those outlines of what should be in the training material, more thought can be given to how specific or not it should be, what those things should look like. It's not that they want to abandon it altogether, but they want to set it aside for now. We have enough to get this first class through, and then we'll reconsider that later. And I know Dr. Badoli had a particular interest in that subject, so I just wanted to let you know that's what the group decided to do. Thank you for not letting me skip that one, Lee. I almost flew right over it. Clarifying eligibility for the exam, that just means that for the full exam that we're about to give, we, people need to be employed in an accredited laboratory in order to be able to sit for it. So people can't just walk in off the street and take this test. For obvious reasons. We talked about the tech reviewer category, we talked about the pilot exam counting. Toxicology interpretation. There was a request that came in that we add a definition of interpretation for toxicology. And Chris Hartzell drafted the definition and sought some input about it. And if you look at your rules, it's in 651.202, page 6, and it says, interpretation for toxicology. Interpretation is the consideration of dose-response relationships between xenobiotics and the resulting behavioral or physical changes to human performance, including the evaluation of pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamics parameters, etc. I just want to point that out, Dr. Kerrigan, to make sure that you put eyes on this.
I put eyes on it, and I would be happy to wordsmith. I mean, I don't like the use of xenobiotics because it suggests that it's something from outside the body, and sometimes we're dealing with drugs that are also endogenous, like GHB. So if we're really paying attention to the words as they're written, maybe there's some.
Okay. Could you offer us the finesse versions? That would be great, so that way we can get it taken care of. We added the current employee language to the waiver section to cover the NMS scenario that I set forth earlier. Dr. Todd had pointed out that we had dropped some language that made some of the toxicology coursework requirement inconsistent, so we fixed that in response to her comments. James Miller had made an edit that we dropped a parenthetical at one point during the revisions that we added again. And then we added In order to be able to process payments through texas.gov, we have to set up the entire, all of the fees right now at the outset, because they run all these tests to make sure that when you run credit cards through, it works. And there are all these rules that are set up by the state comptroller about how to do that. And one of the fees that we hadn't set was if you haven't successfully passed the exam 3 times, you have to ask for special dispensation and pay a fee. And so we added that special fee, dispensation fee to the rules, and it wasn't in there before. So then Lee has this list below, not done yet, postmortem tox exemption, so we'll be striking that. And then we're gonna need to do a rule amendment to address our federal examiners once we figure out what exactly that rule should look like. And that will go out for public comment and come back again as well. Any questions about any of that? So do we don't need a vote, right? Because what's the?
We should take a vote.
I think we
all the edits.
Yeah, to incorporate all.
Okay.
And including whatever Dr. Kerrigan suggests for the interpretation.
Excluding that.
And just to update everybody, these will be adopted as soon as I can get the edits done and get with Dr. Kerrigan on the interpretation definition. So they'll take effect actually 20 days from the date that I publish them next week. So these will be real rules.
And then once those rules are published, if we make amendments to them, they'll go out for public comment again and all that like we've done in the past.
All right, so is there a motion to accept the edits to the licensing program rules with the exception of the postmortem forensic toxicology, the federal examiners, and then whatever is altered or changed in the one area of interpretation, toxicology? Second? All in favor? Opposed? All right, the next thing is an update from the investigative panel regarding the Chifredi case.
We have a presentation. Ronnie? Let me go back there. There he is. Thank you.
What are we doing?
Alright, so as you remember, this is a case that was a complaint that was filed that we've had for quite a while, and at the last meeting, Jody reported that she had really been able to dig into all the materials that the lab provided, which were voluminous, and since then, Jody and Bruce went down to the laboratory and talked to folks there, so this is an update on that. It might be this.
Alright, let's try that. Alright, so this is just an updated timeline of how we've kind of worked through everything. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again for those of you that were here last time. You've seen it already. The updated part is that I did give an update at the February 2nd meeting. Dr. Badoli and I visited the HFSC on March 7th, and on April 2nd, I received another email from HFSC with more responsive documents. The progress that we've made so far, I've looked at all of the corrective actions and quality incidents since 2012 and summarized those. I have spoken to the complainant as well as Robin Guidry. Robin and I have spoken on many occasions. And the lab has been and continues to be very responsive. And I say this every time I come up here, it's amazing how responsive they are and all of the documents that they provide. And anytime we have a suggestion or we have a question, they answer it, and then they try to give us the backstory on why things are the way that they are. And it's really nice to work with a laboratory that is so responsive. I had asked the laboratory to produce several more documents, which they did. So these are the things that I've looked at so far: the quality incidents, corrective actions, internal audits, management system reviews, and also their prep filer validation. One of the reasons why it kind of expanded to this is because every time I would look at something, I would come up with an additional question. So kind of the more I dug, the more questions that I came up with. So that's how this almost ended up being an off-site review of a lot of their management system documentation. And then, like I said, Dr. Bodoli and I went ahead and we visited HFSC. Kind of how this process went, we arrived on site. We did have an opening meeting, and that included speaking to the DNA staff. Basically, we got everybody into a room, explained to them why we were there, and talked to them about what we would be doing, which was interviewing the staff. And I felt terrible because Robin actually pulled a ton of case records for us to look at, to kind of look at some of the contamination incidents. And we did so many interviews that we had no time to look at any of those records while we were there. We did interview the QA staff and Robin, the DNA technical leader. We asked the laboratory to choose a good cross-section of analysts for us to speak to. They obviously know who has the least experience, who's going to have the most experience. And then because their process is segmented, they do have people that are only doing report writing. They do have people that are working in the laboratory doing bench work, and they do have people that only do serology or forensic biology. So we thought the lab would be the best source to get us those individuals. We did tell the analysts, if you are not chosen to speak to us and you would like to speak to us, please just come knock on the door. We did have one staff member that did request to speak to us before we were done at the end of the day. We had a closing meeting that included Robin, the Chief Executive Officer, and the Chief Operations Officer. So we had the DNA management team there as well, just to kind of let them know what the interviews had shown. So to be perfectly clear, these are staff concerns that were expressed during the site visit. These are nothing more than kind of the raw data from what we heard from the analysts. This doesn't mean that the investigative panel agrees with everything that they heard. These are just the perceptions of the staff. 55% of the people that we talked to stated that their perception is that the quantity of casework is more important than the quality of the casework. 72% of the individuals believe the quality of the work environment needed improvement. There's been high turnover since 2016. 17 people have left. 13 of those were resignations. And Robin, did you tell me that there were 32 staff members, or was it 39? 39. 39 staff members total in the DNA unit. There were also concerns about the inadequacy of the training program and how it was applied. In HFSC's own internal audit, which means that they assessed themselves, they actually noted that the training program needed to be updated. The analysts were concerned about a lack of a defined training program, that there was no designated trainer. So basically that meant that, let's say Lee was working on forensic serology and a new hire came in, Lee may be the person that would hire that person, that would train that person in forensic serology, because she had the time or the resources to do so. So there wasn't just one individual person that was performing all of the training. And the training and competency sets do not include large batch samples like those experienced in casework. So several people noted that in their practice sets and in their competency sets, they may be required to do 5 or 10 samples. But then when they went into actual casework, they may be handling 30 or 40 samples. So there wasn't a good correlation between what would be experienced in training versus what is experienced in actual casework. There was also the perception that upper management didn't fully appreciate the concerns or suggestions for improvement. These are some of the areas that we identified for improvement. The need to perform adequate root cause analysis for quality events. HFSC is really great about collating all of the information and doing data analysis like they did with their contamination instances. So it really focused on the workflow and the lab process, but not really kind of digging deep enough into the primary cause of the issue. The need to perform adequate evaluation of the effectiveness of implemented corrective actions. So once you recognize that something has happened, it's a requirement that you do an adequate root cause analysis to determine what the actual issue is, and then you implement corrective actions. Once you implement those corrective actions, you're supposed to go back and assess the effectiveness of the corrective actions that you've actually implemented. There needs to be a substantive training program with consistent implementation, a more effective QA program, and something to address the management and bench staff perceptions of the laboratory environment. So how do those kind of tie back to that original complaint? I made this handy-dandy table at the suggestion of Dr. Hugh Stamps, which I really appreciate that suggestion. Kind of the complaint substance, I think initially everyone thought that the complaint was just there's too much contamination. When you dug into the complaint, you could see that that wasn't actually what the substance of the complaint was. The substance of the complaint was inadequate root cause analysis, and then inadequate corrective actions, and then not doing a good evaluation of those implemented corrective actions. So like I stated previously, I've kind of gone through here and looked at kind of what the review panel saw, and then gave evidence to support what we saw, what our observations were, and then determined that the complaints were actually upheld. We also talked about some steps forward, training for the staff on conducting in-depth root cause analysis, training the staff on implementation of appropriate and measurable corrective actions. I worked in a DNA lab for a very long time, and a lot of time, like when we first kind of started looking into corrective actions, a lot of times the answer was, it was due to analyst inattentiveness, they'll be more careful. Well, that's not really a measurable thing that you can do. You can't measure if somebody is being more careful. There actually needs to be some sort of measurable corrective action that is conducted. And then training for the staff on the evaluation of implemented corrective actions. So these are our recommendations. Develop a stronger training program and update the training manual. Hire a dedicated training coordinator that has subject matter expertise, and they can be utilized to train staff in a more consistent manner. This is something that Texas DPS had implemented quite a long time ago, and it was very effective. When you had a training coordinator that was the person that your trainees went to, and you could train up to 4 or 5 individuals at one time. So it was actually a very efficient method for training new staff. So you weren't pulling 5 people off the bench at one time and then having them each train that individual in something different. Identify and utilize personnel who are good instructors. Just because somebody is a good analyst does not mean that they can then take that information and impart that to a new individual. You need somebody that is a good instructor, that is going to recognize that individuals have different learning styles. Perform evaluation of trainers by trainees and by management. It's important that the trainees that are being trained have a voice in how that trainer actually trained them. If you have someone that comes in and talks at a PhD level, and these folks have a bachelor's degree, they're brand new, they don't understand re-annealing and shadow peaks and spikes and this kind of stuff, and they're like, what is this person talking about? It's not super helpful for them. So if they have some sort of methodology for evaluating their trainers, that can be super helpful, and then having management also evaluate the trainers. Ensuring those practice and competency sets are consistent with what's encountered in casework. Work to improve the relationships between management and bench analysts. This is a long-term effort that will need to be undertaken. We didn't review any casework while we were on site. One of the concerns that we had kind of walking away is that with this many analyst concerns about the training program, how is that training program actually being implemented, and does that have an impact on casework? So, and also performing an assessment of the QA program to ensure that those QA personnel have the authority to perform their job effectively. Does anyone have any questions?
Actually, I had one question. The issues related to maybe some improvements or deficits in training and corrective actions, are those just limited to this particular section, or did you address the fact that if there's sort of a lack of management oversight in those areas, that there may be other sections that might also, that the agency might want to take a closer look at?
That was not something that we looked at while we were on site. We were solely focused on the original Euphrates complaint, and that solely focused on the DNA unit.
Were the corrective actions that were not very effective, were those performed by people within that unit or outside of that unit? I'm kind of getting to the whole issue of whether or not it's systemic or whether it was just within that particular section.
Right, and the memos that I saw were typically written, and Robin, please correct me if I'm wrong, were written by the DNA staff, but then they went through the QA process. I know Robin did a memo, I believe you're the one who wrote the memo in 2016.
That was actually quality.
Oh, it was quality that wrote it,
So,
okay.
just to give you a little bit of an explanation about the process at HFSC, sorry, I'm Erica and I'm with their quality division. The way that it would work is while biology staff would be responsible for basically summarizing the nonconformance, as far as the root cause analysis is concerned, that would be handled by the quality division. They would do all of their investigation and summarize everything that they learned through that investigation process, and then there'd be a collaborative effort on biology's part at the end to make sure that they agree and that they're on board with any of the suggested implements or suggested corrective actions to implement. So the original process would be with the quality division, but towards the end, the biology department would come in and it'd be a collaborative effort.
So does that not mean that if there were issues with the depth of the root cause analysis and the assessment and the follow-through, that really the issue might be with the quality division themselves? I'm not trying to throw a spanner in the works, but very often it's very easy for organizations to stop at the first cause and not identify the root. We know that happens, but in this particular case, if those corrective actions and the root cause analysis is done from outside of the section, maybe the root cause issue is with the quality division, not with the DNA section. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think we saw that because when we started looking into the contamination incidents, they had stopped at, oh, they need better PPE, they need this. And then when we went on site and we started interviewing staff, we realized that they hadn't actually gone all the way into what was causing some of those contamination incidents. And I think the true root cause is, at least partially, the training program and how that was implemented, because that was noted that there was a newer analyst that was having some issues, and then all of these other things came out about the training program. So I do agree that they did stop short of getting to that true root cause. Now, whether that has been evaluated by the laboratory system on a whole as to if the issue is more related to the whole QA program or if it's limited to DNA, I can't answer that, but I think.
Well, and to address that, we are looking at the whole system, not just based on this, but just based on in general with root cause analysis. We have new staff in the quality division right now. Also, just in general, we felt that there was a gap between how much the quality division understood root cause analysis and how much our supervisors and managers understood it. And we want it to be a more collaborative effort to where it's not that it's all on quality to come in and do that root cause analysis and then be collaborative. And so right now we're working on figuring out, you know, the practical way to train close to 200 people in it, but we're starting with all supervisors and managers, basically supervisors and above, going through root cause analysis training with our quality division so that this whole corrective action process is more collaborative from the beginning, and that we're expecting more from our analysts at the bench level to be involved in that, because I think they're going to learn more that way. And so we've identified that gap not just in biology, but in the whole company, and we're addressing it with the whole company with biology involved in that.
And I think too, just to address the question of the original root cause, the original corrective action did stop at implementing, PPE requirements. I think we've then revisited that, I know we've now revisited that, and now we're providing more of PPE awareness and PPE education, and I think that's a significant difference in the way we looked at it originally and the way that we revisited it. And it's not just telling staff, you need to put PPE on, it's making them understand why they need to put PPE on and seeing the results of that actively wearing PPE and communicating that better and making that communication and that information part of the training program. So, I mean, I guess my point is that, we did revisit the original corrective action and further corrective actions have been made in addition.
Okay. Since this was an update, there's nothing to vote on. So, number 7.
Well, do you want to instruct Jody what to do next?
Well, then we should put a final report together on that so that we can review and adopt it.
So you can bring that back.
Yeah, next. Okay, number 7.
So I thought we were gonna have a report for you on the Bryan case, which you remember involves both complaints about the blood spatter and about the serology that was originally done, but we had requested some follow-up information from DPS, which I got yesterday afternoon, and we just haven't had time to do it, to analyze it, much less write up a report. So we'll have that for you next time.
All right, then we can move to number 8, which is the Harris County blood alcohol whale case.
So the only reason this is here is because last time you had adopted it with the caveat that if Dr. Kerrigan had edits to the report, that those would be amended. And so she's had a chance to review it, so I wanted to put it on here in case she had edits. She has no edits, so.
All right, so then do we have?
It'll be published, yeah.
Okay, so
There's
do we?
nothing else has to happen.
Okay, all right. All right, number 9, the DPS Garland.
All right, so in your materials, there's a report regarding the testimony of Christopher Young on blood alcohol cases that we went over. You have the DPS OIG report, and the only thing that has changed really from the version that you had in the share file, DPS gave us some comments on some of the recommendations, and most of them were just clarifications that they have implemented some of the things that we were suggesting on here already. So for example, we had talked at a prior meeting about this new training that DPS rolled out that covers expert testimony issues, and at one point that was only rolled out for drug chemistry statewide at their statewide annual meeting, but now it's going to become a mandatory part of their training manual. Additionally, there's a comment in here about the need to ensure that testimony monitoring is done by people who have subject matter expertise, so they may be able to pick up on things that otherwise would not be caught. There's actually an A&AB requirement that's going to be coming out that will force the labs to do that by January 1st of 2019, so they're working to address the logistics behind that. So just some things that we updated in these recommendations based on their feedback. Does anybody have questions about any of this? It basically just, concurs with the OIG's findings and then offers some areas for improvement. There was no real need to redo the DPS OIG report because it was very thorough and it went through lots of examples of testimonial inconsistencies and so forth. So, does anybody have any questions about it? So you can
We had the same thing, so by virtue of no corrections, we didn't have to vote on this one.
No, but you had already approved
Right.
Will.
All right.
Yeah.
So, do I have a motion to adopt the final report on DPS Garland?
I'll make the motion.
Second? All in favor? Opposed? Number 10.
Number 10 is the report on the investigation that was done in the NMS case, and I would say the only change from what was originally sent to you to what you have before you now is, originally I had a paragraph in the report describing some of the details around the implications of a conclusion that there were at least 3 contributors in the anorectal swab in the Torney case, and instead of sort of using that example, I expanded this language to talk more generally about what happens in the context of sexual assault cases. Generally, when a laboratory reaches a conclusion about the number of contributors that is not actually based on the data, the effect that can have on undermining the survivor's account of what happened, more generally rather than just the specific Torney example, because I think that goes to the concern of why the commission reviewed a case that was litigated on the other side of the country. The real issue is, if you look at the top of page 11, the general implications that this can have in terms of sexual assault cases with unknown assailants. So if anybody has any questions, Dr. Badoli has recused himself. So does the recommendations and observations, any comments, questions? So then we need a motion to adopt.
So we have a motion to adopt this final report. Second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
We will be getting updates because NMS retained a consultant to help, and she's identified some issues, so they'll be updating us quarterly on how things are going there. Number 11 is HB 34. So, as you might recall, there was a legislative initiative called the Tim Cole Exoneration Review Commission, and the bill that came out of that HB 34 asked the commission to do 2 things. One is to focus on field drug testing, and the other one is on crime scene training. So we thankfully, with the help of OCA research staff who do these reports all the time, because they often get assigned them at the end of the legislative session as part of their duties, they're helping us with sort of setting up a project plan, tracking all of the items in the project plan, and making sure that we're able to meet that December 1st deadline for generating a report in these areas. So we'll have further updates for you in subsequent meetings, but I just want to let you know that is on track. And we even have a whole project manager who's dedicated to helping us make sure these reports get done on time.
That's a pretty big undertaking.
It is not a small undertaking. But having said that, the OCA folks have said, in these situations where you get assigned a report with no funding, you do the best you can do. And that's all you can do. And sometimes it's limited to making observations and suggestions more than anything else.
On the drug field test kits, do you know what they're actually doing, how they're investigating that?
So Jody has actually done some work on reaching out to the vendors to find out, to ask them for their validation studies, which I don't think they really have.
No, because they're all based upon the spot tests that are performed in the laboratory anyway. So one company that I reached out to, it was an individual who had worked for a state police in another state, and then just kind of started this business. I don't want to say out of his garage, but it kind of sounds like it's out of his garage. And I asked, I said, well, what type of validation studies have you done? And he's like, well, my dad did it when he worked for the state police in this other state, and that's just kind of where he developed it from. And I'm like, well, your balance is calibrated? And, well, no, we just have this stuff that we order. So it was a little concerning. I'm sure that other companies don't do it that way. This was just small, I mean, I would hope, sure, I hope other companies aren't doing it this way. But that was kind of the response that, well, there really are no validation studies that these companies have.
Yeah, I know Jasmine and I talked about this at one of the other meetings, that the proficiency of the law enforcement officer conducting the test is extremely, apparently extremely poor. Either they've not been trained or, but yeah, I'm just curious how we're looking at this.
Yeah, we've started looking at the training issue, and from what we know, basically, in most jurisdictions, there's an insert in the kit that has instructions on it, and that's what they read.
That's the extent of the training.
That's the extent of the training.
Yeah.
And so in Nevada, they actually started a process where they track the field tests. And once an officer gets 2 false positives, they have to go back and be retrained. They actually go through a training program to use these kits. There is no formal process like that here. So those are some of the things that we'll be reporting on and observing on. And
That's an interesting approach, and in that state, presumably, have they standardized the type of field drug test kits that are being used?
I think so.
Yeah, that's the
So
only
they
way
all
that would
use the
work.
same ones. But I don't think in a state as big as Texas, I can't imagine how we would track, erroneous field test results. It would just be too big of a project. So DPS is working on some potential solutions to these issues, so we're gonna talk with them about what some of those are. I don't know if you wanna wait for a subsequent meeting, or if you wanna talk about any of that now.
It'd be better for us to wait, because we're kind of in an early step, but we're moving away. DPS officers do not do any field testing, and it's mostly based on officer safety. And there is a need to potentially do some field testing just to be able to press charges at time of arrest. So we've been tasked with, is there a suitable way, maintaining officer safety, to do some type of field testing? So we're looking at Raman devices to see if that is a technology that can be put out there in the field. We've actually we've completed the purchase process of 3 different Raman devices. We're going to do a validation, and we're going to validate from a scientific perspective, and then we're also going to employ some officers in our validation study. We would like to then take those results and discuss that with the commission, and we'd also like to discuss that with the TDCAA to see if there is a court-type lab component to it, but our primary goal is just to protect officer safety.
So a lot of the jurisdictions aren't doing field tests anymore because of the potential fentanyl and carfentanil.
And that's become problematic for prosecutors, because then you're looking at whether or not you're pressing a charge on an on-site arrest with no field test. And so the only thing you have is an officer observation as to whether or not this is cocaine or methamphetamine, which is kind of fraught with difficulty.
Eyeball.
Yeah, eyeball meth or something like that. So that it does, and so we've been kind of working with our local DPS people to decide whether or not we're even going to take a charge on an on-site arrest. And so we kind of settled into some sort of compromise if we can find some other factor, whether they're baggies or scales or something like that, other than just the officer's basically observation that this is a controlled substance. You're not talking about marijuana, but we're talking about controlled substances that are not, you can't just look at. So this is problematic. So when y'all get this ramen or whatever that test is, please let us know, and I'll push that out to TDCA and let them know.
Very good.
So I think the challenge for the jurisdictions that have said they're not going to accept, they're not going to allow cases to be settled on field tests is that then, depending on the timing of the lab test and the type of offense, those people may they may end up in county jail, I guess it would be for longer.
You're just awaiting lab results. Now, what we've done is that in our particular jurisdiction, we've worked to basically subsidize a chemist at DPS with an MOU where the county is paying for the chemist to decrease the amount of time that that person's in jail, because the chemist's priority is Brazos County cases, and that's worked well for us. So that's kind of helped in that regard. But other counties, when we were waiting 6 to 9 months for a lab result, and you're not doing a field test, that is problematic, especially when, if you're in jail, you have 90 days to indict someone. So, see the different issues that we have. So we kind of bypass that problem other ways by talking with our commissioners court, but it will be a problem, especially for smaller counties.
Jarvis, I was just going to say that APD's exploring, we're looking at associated with some grant opportunities, also the field version, which I think similar technology that Brady was referring to for officer safety, specifically for the fentanyl and carfentanil. But then we're also getting a benchtop version of that same technology for confirmatory purposes or laboratory. That's the goal, though, whether or not we'll get the funding approved, that's what we're trying to do, so that we can validate both and how it's a screening tool and a confirmatory tool.
We have projects like that that are already underway at our institution, so we need to talk.
All right, anything else? All right, we've already done 12, so number 13.
Dr. Joey, did you want to say anything about the status of the case review of the AP cases?
It's going along the same as last time, just going through them slowly and nothing new of note other than some we get better stats by reinterpreting, some are inconclusive, and but I haven't found anything different than the previous ones.
One of the things that, if you might all recall, that we had asked APD, or recommended in that their initial report on the APD DNA lab, was that they do a study of the performance of the AP reagent, because the analysts were not, as a matter of practice, mixing the reagent fresh daily. And so DPS did that reagent study, and it is in your materials. I think the takeaways from it, the first one is that the reagent persisted longer than I think the Ohio study had shown it to persist, which was the study that the manufacturer provided as an indication that it should be mixed fresh daily. Having said that, the Ohio study had used potato AP and not actual semen, so that may have something to do with it, I don't know.
Yeah, I think this may not be different than the previous discussion, is it looks like the company that produced this reagent didn't really do the testing. They just produced it and started using it and relied on some study, and this may be another weakness of those who manufacture not following through, doing the necessary work up front, and everybody just accepted it as is.
The other thing that I think is the takeaway from the AP reagent study, and Dr. Houston, or Dr. Billy, correct me, but there were some differences in the way so it was run on a parallel track. There were analysts at the APD headquarters laboratory that were doing the study, and then there were analysts who are former APD analysts in the capital area lab also doing the study, and there were differences noted in the way that, because this is a test where you're judging a change of color on a sort of a score of 1, 2, 3, or 4, and there were differences between the way the headquarters staff called the color changes versus the way the APD staff called them. And if you look in your materials at tab 13, there's some some screenshots here that show some of the calls. And I mean, in a nutshell, and I can let Bruce and Sheree talk about this some more, there were some weaker changes that were called 4+ by the former APD analysts, and so the conclusion was that there needs to be a root cause analysis done about why there are differences between the calls being made at headquarters and the calls being made by the former APD analysts, considering that they were retrained on these concepts. So we're
I think you guys are gonna be looking into why there's a difference.
Correct, yeah, we're looking at it from a system-wide perspective, because the one other issue in the Westfield lab that was in the I don't know if it was a self-disclosure section of the agenda, also involves AP. So we're doing a root cause across the system about the use of AP reagents in the lab system.
No, that's exactly what the study showed. I mean, essentially, overall, it did show that there was, that the reagent was lasting longer than what they originally expected, which was fine. But yes, the differences between essentially saying that the Austin lab workers were reporting positive results a lot longer when there were negative results from the other way around. Sorry, the capital area was sustaining with positive results longer than the Austin lab. So there was big differences there between the two sources. So it definitely comes back to a training issue again.
Yeah, so there's how did they test these samples? Did they follow the directions of the study versus how they used AP in casework versus a training issue with particular individuals versus are they using time versus intensity or just time to grade the test? And it's a subjective test and it's a color change, and so those are all need to be wrapped up in a good root cause.
Yeah, I guess that maybe just point out, because obviously there's a difference, but the outcome may not change for interpretation, because since it's either you get a signal or you don't, a 1 or a 4, you still proceed forward. So although they called it differently, it may not change the ability, what's going forward with the analysis, to keep that in mind. But there's clearly a difference in, I think some were doing time and some were doing color. So.
I think one of the concerns is that if the positive control is in fact a 1+ reaction, and they score it as a 4+, that then when they test a stain, the AP reagent isn't acting appropriately. So they may actually not get that weak positive or that 1+ reaction. So then there could potentially be semen stains that are missed.
Maybe, or that one, what they're calling 1+ may be a really good reaction. So I'm just saying is you just don't have all the information, because this is an eyeball kind of test. And we saw some calling these things weak 4+ is another one. So until they get to the root of that, I think it's hard to make a true assessment of the impact.
Yeah, that's just the concern that I have. So I just wanted to put that out there.
There's a clear difference in the performance, and that's what has to be.
Yeah, when looking at the test results, I didn't notice that they were calling something a 1+ that was in fact a 4+. It was pretty consistent that it was them calling something that was in fact a 1+, one that looked like a 1+ according to the photos, because obviously that's all we have, as a 4+, not calling a 4+ a 1+. So it was.
I go more like some things with weak signal were given the same score as things with strong signal. What's a 1+, 2+, 3+? I still think that's sort of an unknown, given the information is more in depth.
Well, I think that just overall highlights the subjective nature of the test stuff and why it's a presumptive test.
Or is it misleading might not be the right word, but these colorimetric tests, which I've never really been a big fan of, but sometimes it's the best you got. By saying 4+, 3+, 2+, 1+, are we giving the indication that's some way quantitative when it's really a qualitative assay? That's the thing that I'm like, so maybe we need to get away from that practice, and it's positive or negative or something. Maybe we could do better with either validating what those mean or something that's to it. I'm not sure what. But.
And then also relying on photography. So we're
Yeah,
not
it's
sure
true.
if the photography is done exactly correct or the same, similar with all 4 individuals that were involved in the study. And then they were all taken at 1 minute when presumably some of these folks called it at 15 seconds. So that also adds a subjective nature.
So you guys will let us know when you're done.
Yes, ma'am. We will.
All right, 14.
Sure, so, step 1 was to revise the Texas Evidence Collection Protocol from 1998. So Lori Charles is leading that effort at Texas A&M. She gave me a timeline yesterday for that. Internally, we're going to have a final draft by the 15th of May. June 1st, we want to post a public comment period for 30 days. Now, she has it, she's gonna send these out on listservs to Texas forensic nurses, OAG certified nurse examiners, coordinators, and medical directors, CHAT, which I'm not sure what that is, and the Texas Hospital Association. So if there's other people that want information, want to be included in that listserv, that would be appreciated, because they're obviously very medical centric, and I know there's other disciplines that want.
Well, I think the district attorneys and the crime labs both have a high investment in that.
Okay, so let me just say that although it's called the Texas Evidence Collection Protocol, they're not necessarily including physical evidence collection specifications in the update. They're just telling people to refer to the national protocol.
Well, we're probably gonna have a lot of discussion on that when it comes out then.
Their evidence, as nurses, we conceptualize evidence as greater than just the physical evidence, and so there's a lot about teaching people to use correct terminology in anatomical areas, which is, as we know, also important. I'm not leading this effort, so I had to defer to Ms. Charles and Stacy Mitchell, but I tried to advocate for them that I think some people expect the protocol to include the best evidence collection practices. I will say though that our coordinator of our program, Stacy Mitchell, was appointed to the NIST Standardization Committee to devise best practices, so I know that they're aware that that is important, but.
Well, I spoke to the dean of the medical school about, I think that's where the grant landed, about the importance of that, and said that we'd be glad to interact with them, and never got a phone call, so we'll be glad to scrutinize their update.
I welcome that. So then the next thing, we're hoping to have the protocol to the OAG for a signature by September 1st, and then step 2 is going to be to standardize the kits in conjunction with DPS, and have that timed for the evidence tracking that has to start a year from September 1st. That's all, that's what I know.
Did you say Jenny Black was on that list? Your list of names of the people that are on there?
Jenny Black is a SANE coordinator, so
Right,
she will
she's
get
on.
that.
I just wanted to
She will certainly.
She just
get
made an
the
update to
information.
one of the collection storage tubes, and so I just wanted to make sure that gets part.
She will get it, yeah.
Thank you for dealing with this issue. It's a big deal. I mean, around this, well, nationally, but it's a big deal in the state about making sure that the right evidence gets collected and gets labeled correctly and gets handled correctly. So, and I realize there's more to it in handling the patient, but in terms of what we do, we don't get to deal with that part of it. So I certainly know there's more to it, but the evidence collection is significant. So if they're just kind of parroting something and not really looking at it, that's probably not going to be just routinely accepted without more questions. Thank you. All right.
We have the lunches. Do you want to eat while we?
Well, we might be able to be through in 5 minutes and sit and have lunch afterwards if you want to do it that way.
Okay. While everybody's paying attention, did anybody lose a parking ticket?
Mine, yes. Oh, no, it's mine. I've got
The
mine.
ticket, the
Okay.
I hope it's not something already. If anybody finds they're missing one, I have it.
Who's here? You had let Bob go first because he had to go, but we skipped over the mixture. Did you have any update, Katie? No? Okay. We're still plugging along.
Sorry about that. I was trying to get Bob out so that he could get back. All right, so 15 is update on CACLAD. Is Dr. Stout here?
So Dr. Stout is not here tonight.
No, he's not here.
Is there anybody from the tech lead that
I think their biggest issue has been just making sure that they have a say
In the test.
in the exam. Other than that, do you know of anything else, Chris?
I don't. That's been the focus that I've heard from Patrick recently.
Okay.
That's what I heard from Peter too, yesterday or the day before.
All right, 16, recent and upcoming conference presentations.
I'm trying to think, you have done some, you have a presentation coming up at TVCAA, right?
Yes, in June, I'm giving a presentation there, and then I went to the, actually Dr. Billy and I both went to the Missing Migrant Initiative meeting down in the Rio Grande Valley last week. And attended that.
The agenda for the Missing Migrant Initiative is in the back here. They had a lot of people there. And I think it, I wasn't able to go because we were in the middle of the pilot test, but I think they're making some progress on issues around identifying missing people who cross over and don't make it past the checkpoint. I did meet with Dr. Villanueva, who's a forensic pathologist from Honduras and runs the country's entire crime laboratory system. She just won something called the International Women of Courage Award from the State Department. They only give 10 of them out every year. The First Lady actually presented that award to her recently, and she was in Austin, and so I got a chance to meet with her and have dinner with her, and they are just very excited. If you remember, one of the challenges that the commission had in dealing with this issue about identifying missing people is that there's been a database established of family reference samples that cannot be checked against CODIS because of FBI rules around the collection of samples and so forth. And I think there's a lot of optimism in the Northern Triangle countries in particular that they are shoring up their DNA capabilities so that they will be able to really take responsibility for liaising with the United States government when it comes to making these identifications, collecting the family reference samples in country, and complying with all of the FBI protocols so that the searches can be made against the main national database as opposed to a smaller database. So what we're trying to do is sort of support them in that. And Dr. Vidoli's been back and forth to Central America a bunch, and so has Dr. Coble. And I don't know how many of you know Mike Coble, but he was very much involved when we took on the DNA mixture project. He helped us with the article that he and Bruce and others wrote on CPI interpretation. He's just joined UNT Health Science Center from NIST. We are extremely lucky to have him. The state of Texas is. We really have a dream team on DNA now in the state, and so welcome, Mike. And you've been to Guatemala too, so Mike is working on this as well. And they're really trying to help those countries get their DNA capabilities up to where they need to be. Did you want to say anything else, Dr. Vidoli?
I'd like to say something really important because Mike's part of the team, but he became very ill while he was down in Guatemala, so they brought in 2 physicians to help cure him. One a regular practicing one, and one more along Jeff's occupation.
That's always a bad
So just in case the patient didn't pull through,
Let's suggest you're on the balance there. Then you got 2
exactly how I handled it.
spectrums.
So he's a great asset to our group, and we have high hopes to do bigger and better things.
The discussion of my death was very premature.
And I gave Mike a book when he came today that's going to teach him how to be a real Texan. Not that I'm really the one to be educating people.
You've taken to it quickly, haven't you?
So, I don't. Do you have anything else?
Do we have any particular agenda items for the next meeting that we need to discuss?
I think we've captured them all.
It's the earliest meeting we've had.
We've got
I have two things I think we have to address.
Sure.
One is, because we have to be just reaccredited Siri, but I think there's a gap in that, because we did do the review of Siri, but we never did follow up on if they ever met their review, and somehow they've gotten a letter of they were okay. So I think that fell between the cracks somewhere. We may have to revisit that.
So, what, if you remember when we started tackling the DNA mixture interpretation issue, Bruce looked at the protocols and some sample cases for all of the publicly funded crime laboratories. And we kept saying that we were gonna move to the private labs as soon as we could, but we really didn't have the resource. But now that we have Jody on board, she's gonna start working, she's already started working with the private labs that do DNA analysis to do the same assessment, and Siri will be part of that. So
Yeah.
that is a
Because there's a gap, because I became aware that they've been, it was a letter written from the commission and approved, but I don't think we ever really did work, so something got messed up over there somewhere.
There was an
So
initial.
they renewed their accreditation recently with the accrediting body.
Yeah.
So on the accreditation side, we issued them a certificate.
Which we do because that's.
Automatically.
No. There was a letter that we reviewed them, and they met all the corrective actions on the mixture, and I don't believe we actually
So the
checked to
letter,
see if they did that. That's the problem.
the letter that we wrote just stated what was done, and how they use it in court is sort of a separate question.
So it's just an issue that we may have to address.
You had made some recommendations about things they needed to do, and so we need to go back and see.
Yeah, that's what I just bringing that up. And the other one is, we didn't talk about the, since the Torney thing's been reviewed, and that there's this big issue about the accreditors. Because it doesn't seem like the accreditors followed through, and what's their root cause analysis, and
Yeah. So we need to go back to ANAB, I think, and ask them, you know, here's the report.
Yeah,
Are
that's
you
out
gonna
there.
do a root cause analysis of these issues? So we can.
I think that will follow when the report's released anyway, because it's talked about in the report.
So I do think Dr. Verdoli makes a good point, which is that we're gonna need to elicit a response from them. I don't know that they're going to.
Yeah, raise it themselves, yeah.
Okay. Dr. Slider, you have a look like you wanna say something. No?
Well, certainly the commission has to approve the accrediting bodies that are acceptable in order to achieve commission accreditation.
Right.
And that is kind of the hammer that you hold. However, at this point in time, there isn't
It's
another
kind of a
one.
monopoly.
They have a monopoly.
Right.
they have a monopoly, but, you know, for an agency who has obviously some issues that were identified, and well aware of it for longer than just this report coming out, and not being able to do their own root cause analysis when they're assessing how everyone else does their root cause analysis.
I think you're on the moral high ground.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, do we have the next meeting already scheduled?
Yep, July 20.
July 20.
This mixture.
But also,
Yeah, July 20.
I did want to say that it appears that this may be the last meeting that one of our colleagues will be attending. As Dr. Hughes Tam has decided to move back to the area that has the most poisonous snakes in the world, for whatever reason. So if I can't be at the next meeting, someone else will have to
Yes,
be
there'll
in
be
charge.
another SAM representative. Don't know who that is yet, but.
I will wish you good luck.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed my time here and met wonderful people and got a really good insight into operational side of things, which
Yeah.
I've learned a lot.
Enough to send you back across the world.
Send me back to the beach.
Thank you, Cherie, for your service.
Thank you. Can we come visit you?
Of course you can. Please come visit.
So if there's any public comment? If none, do you have a motion to adjourn? Second? All in favor? Yes. Okay, we'll get lunch.